Welcome back to another story on Infidelity Tales Lab. Before we begin, tell us, where in the world are you watching from? Now, let's dive into today's story. Chapter 1. The Burn. The steam from the iron hissed like a serpent as Miranda Caldwell pressed the heated metal against her 23-year-old daughter's forearm. Crystal Lancaster's scream pierced through the suburban evening, a sound that would haunt the Caldwell household forever. Trash deserves to burn. Miranda laughed, her voice carrying a venom that seemed foreign coming from a woman who had once sung lullabies to the same child, now writhing in pain on the kitchen floor. Brian Raymond, Crystal's 25-year-old half-brother, watched from the doorway with cold amusement. "If I were her, I'd have burned her face too," he snorted, adjusting his designer jacket, a gift from his mother's latest shopping spree. Aaron Haley stood in the shadows of the hallway, his weathered hands clenched into fists. At 52, he had built an empire from nothing, a construction company that employed over 300 people across the state. His steel-gray eyes, which had intimidated union negotiators and corrupt politicians alike, now burned with a fury that made his professional reputation seem tame. He didn't cry. He didn't shout. He simply watched as his wife of 15 years revealed her true nature, and his stepson, the boy he had raised since age 10, showed his gratitude with cruelty. Aaron had met Miranda when Crystal was 8 and Brian was 10. Their father, a deadbeat named Thomas Lancaster, had abandoned them for a cocktail waitress in Vegas. Aaron had stepped in, not just as a provider, but as a father figure who had funded Brian's college education, bought Crystal her first car, and treated them as his own blood. The burn would heal, but the betrayal cut deeper than any physical wound. As Miranda tended to her manicured nails, seemingly forgetting the child writhing on the floor, Aaron made his decision. He knelt beside Crystal, his calloused hands gentle as he examined the iron-shaped wound on her forearm. "We're leaving," he told her quietly. "Aaron, don't be dramatic," Miranda called from across the kitchen, not even turning around. She had it coming. Little bitch was disrespecting me in my own house. Crystal's offense had been questioning why her mother needed another shopping trip when Aaron was working 70-hour weeks to maintain their lifestyle. The girl worked 2 jobs, waiting tables and cleaning offices, trying to save for nursing school while living at home. Aaron helped Crystal to her feet, noting how Brian smirked at his sister's pain. The boy had always been Miranda's favorite, spoiled and entitled despite Aaron's attempts to instill work ethic and respect. Now Aaron saw the rot that had been growing beneath the surface. "Pack your things," Aaron told Crystal. "Both of you." Miranda finally turned, her Botox-frozen forehead unable to furrow despite her confusion. "What are you talking about? You burned my daughter. Your son thinks it's funny. I'm done. Your daughter." Brian stepped forward, his 6-foot frame trying to intimidate. "She's not your blood, old man. None of us are." Aaron's smile was colder than a Montana winter. "You're right. And you just reminded me why that matters." As Crystal gathered her few belongings, Aaron made a phone call to his lawyer, Carl Welch, then another to his accountant, Stuart Hunter. By morning, the wheels would be in motion. Miranda laughed, the sound sharp and bitter. "You think you can just leave? I'll take half of everything you've built, Aaron. I know about the offshore accounts, the shell companies. My lawyer will destroy you." Aaron's expression didn't change. He had built his fortune through calculation, patience, and the ability to see 10 moves ahead. Miranda had just revealed she'd been digging into his finances, something that explained certain discrepancies he'd noticed in his accounts. "We'll see," was all he said. That night, Aaron and Crystal checked into a hotel suite downtown. As Crystal slept, exhausted from pain and emotional trauma, Aaron sat on the balcony overlooking the city he had helped build. Construction cranes bearing his company's logo dotted the skyline like metal sentinels. He thought about Miranda's confidence, her smug certainty that she held all the cards. She had clearly been planning this for a while, probably encouraged by someone who knew enough about divorce proceedings to feel bold. Aaron pulled out his phone and scrolled through Miranda's contacts, something he'd memorized years ago out of protective instinct. One name stood out: Seth Flowers, Miranda's personal trainer, who had been making frequent appearances in their home while Aaron worked. A few discreet phone calls to his security contacts revealed what he'd suspected. Miranda and Seth had been carrying on an affair for over a year. The trainer, a failed actor turned fitness instructor, had expensive tastes and mounting debts. Aaron smiled as he pieced together the puzzle. Seth had been feeding Miranda information about asset protection and divorce strategies, probably from his own experience with a messy divorce from his first wife. They had been planning to take Aaron for everything he was worth. But Aaron Haley had been playing games of strategy since he was a child, surviving in Chicago's toughest neighborhoods. These suburban schemers had no idea who they were dealing with. As dawn broke over the city, Aaron began making a list, not of assets to protect or lawyers to call, but of pressure points and weaknesses. Every person had them, triggers that could unravel their entire world if pressed correctly. Miranda loved her social status and her position as a respected member of the country club set. Seth craved legitimacy and acceptance in circles that had always looked down on him. Brian depended on his mother's support and his stepfather's connections to maintain his lifestyle. Aaron had given them everything. Now he would take it all back, piece by piece, and watch them destroy themselves in the process. The game was about to begin. Chapter 2, The Discovery. 3 days after the iron incident, Aaron sat in his corner office on the 42nd floor of the Haley building, reviewing the intelligence his private investigator had gathered. Todd Mayer was the best in the business, a former FBI agent who specialized in corporate espionage and domestic investigations. "It's worse than we thought," Todd said, sliding a thick folder across Aaron's mahogany desk. "The affair started 14 months ago. Seth Flowers isn't just her trainer. He's been positioning himself as her business advisor." Aaron opened the folder, his face remaining impassive as he reviewed photographs, financial records, and recorded conversations. Miranda and Seth had been meeting regularly at the Riverside Hotel, but they'd also been conducting meetings with lawyers, real estate agents, and investment advisors. "They've been planning the divorce for months," Todd continued. "Seth convinced her to start documenting your emotional abuse and controlling behavior. She's been building a case for spousal abuse to maximize her settlement." The irony wasn't lost on Aaron. While Miranda crafted false narratives of abuse, she had literally branded his daughter with a hot iron. "There's more," Todd said, producing a second set of documents. "Seth owes money to some very unpleasant people. His gambling debts total close to $200,000, and his creditors aren't the type to accept payment plans." Aaron studied a surveillance photo of Seth meeting with two men outside a casino. Even from a distance, their body language screamed intimidation. "Your wife has been secretly liquidating assets to help pay his debts," Todd continued. "She sold jewelry, took cash advances on credit cards, even borrowed against your daughter's college fund." Aaron's jaw tightened. Crystal had been working herself to exhaustion, believing she needed to save every penny for nursing school, while her mother stole from her future to fund her affair. The investigation revealed more disturbing details. Brian wasn't just complicit in his mother's schemes. He was actively participating. The boy had been feeding Seth information about Aaron's business dealings, using his access to the family's private spaces to photograph documents and record conversations. "Brian's been promised a partnership in a new business venture," Todd explained. "Seth convinced Miranda that you'd never put the boy in your will as a real son, so they needed to secure his future independently." Aaron pulled up Brian's financial records on his computer. The boy had been living far beyond his means. Expensive clothes, restaurant bills, a BMW lease that cost more than most people's mortgages, all funded by credit cards that Miranda co-signed. The family Aaron had built and protected for 15 years had been systematically betraying him while he worked himself to exhaustion providing for them. But the deepest cut came in the final pages of Todd's report. Audio recordings from the house, obtained through security cameras Aaron had installed for protection, revealed conversations between Miranda and Brian about Crystal. "She's not even his real daughter," Miranda's voice crackled through the speakers. "And she's always been a pathetic little mouse. Aaron only keeps her around out of guilt." Brian's laughter followed. "She'll never amount to anything anyway. Might as well put her in her place now." Aaron had heard enough. He dismissed Todd and sat alone in his office as the sun, set over the city. From his window, he could see the construction site where his latest project was taking shape, a medical complex that would employ hundreds and serve thousands. He thought about his own childhood, growing up in poverty with an alcoholic father and a mother who worked 3 jobs to keep them housed and fed. Every success, every achievement had been earned through blood, sweat, and an absolute refusal to accept defeat. Miranda came from privilege, but had squandered every opportunity. Seth was a parasite who targeted successful people to fund his failures. Brian had been handed every advantage, but chose entitlement over effort. They had confused Aaron's generosity for weakness, his love for stupidity. Now, they would learn the difference between a provider and a predator. Aaron made his first call to Randall Dotson, a lawyer who specialized in asset protection and complex corporate structures. The second call went to Clay Abbott, a real estate developer who had been trying to buy one of Aaron's prime properties for years. By midnight, Aaron had restructured his entire financial empire. Shell companies were dissolved, assets were transferred, and ownership structures were reorganized. Miranda would find that the money she thought she could claim had vanished like smoke. But financial protection was just the beginning. Aaron's Real plan required patience, precision, and a deep understanding of human psychology. He pulled up the contact information for Enrique McCormick, the best private security consultant on the West Coast. Enrique had helped Aaron deal with union disputes and corporate sabotage in the past, but this job would require more creative solutions. The final call went to Mark Mead, a media consultant who specialized in reputation management. Aaron had a story to tell, and he wanted to make sure it reached the right audiences at the right time. As Aaron left his office that night, he stopped by the construction site where it all began. 23 years ago, he had started with nothing but a pickup truck and a willingness to work harder than anyone else. Every building, every success, every dollar had been earned through determination and strategic thinking. Miranda, Seth, and Brian thought they were playing checkers. They had no idea Aaron had already begun a game of chess where he controlled every piece on the board. The first move had been made when they chose betrayal over loyalty. Now Aaron would show them how a real strategist plays to win. Chapter 3. The Foundation. Aaron stood in the abandoned warehouse on the outskirts of town, watching as Enrique McCormick's team set up surveillance equipment and communication systems. The building, officially condemned and scheduled for demolition, would serve as headquarters for what Aaron privately called Operation Reset. The beauty of this location, Enrique explained as he tested camera feeds, is that it doesn't exist on paper anymore. City records show it was demolished last month. Aaron nodded, appreciating the irony. Like his marriage, this building appeared intact on the surface while being fundamentally destroyed underneath. Crystal sat at a makeshift desk, her bandaged arm resting carefully as she reviewed documents. Despite her pain, she had insisted on helping with the research. The burn mark would fade, but her trust in family had been permanently scarred. "I found something interesting about Seth's background," she said, holding up a file. "His real name is Seth Flowers, but he used to go by Stephen Fletcher when he was married to his first wife." Aaron examined the documents. Seth had changed his name after a messy divorce that left him bankrupt and facing assault charges. Charges that were dropped when his ex-wife mysteriously withdrew her complaint and left the state. "There's a pattern here," Crystal continued. "He targets older women, usually divorced or widowed, with substantial assets. Miranda is his third mark in 5 years." The research revealed Seth's methodology: establish himself as a fitness trainer at upscale gyms, identify wealthy female clients going through emotional transitions, and slowly insert himself into their lives as both lover and financial advisor. His first victim lost her house, Crystal read from the file. The second one ended up declaring bankruptcy. Seth always manages to walk away clean while they lose everything. Aaron felt a cold satisfaction as the pieces fell into place. Seth wasn't just an opportunistic parasite. He was a career predator who had chosen the wrong target. Mark Mead arrived at noon with a van full of video equipment and a team of journalists who specialized in investigative exposés. Aaron had hired them to document everything, but not for the reasons anyone expected. "The story you want to tell," Mark explained as his team set up cameras, isn't about revenge. It's about protection. You're a successful businessman whose family was infiltrated by a con artist, and you're taking steps to protect other potential victims. The narrative was perfect. Aaron would be seen as a concerned citizen exposing a dangerous criminal, not a husband seeking vengeance. The documentation would serve multiple purposes: evidence for legal proceedings, material for public exposure, and insurance against any attempts by Miranda and Seth to rewrite history. That afternoon, Aaron met with Willard Sweeney, a forensic accountant who had helped him navigate complex business deals in the past. Willard had been analyzing Miranda's financial activities, and the results were damning. She's been systematically embezzling from your personal accounts, Willard reported. Small amounts at first, but increasing over time. The total is approaching 6 figures. That's not embezzlement, Aaron corrected. Those are joint accounts. Legally, she had every right to withdraw that money. Willard smiled. Not if the funds were being used to commit fraud or support criminal activities. Seth's gambling debts aren't just markers at legitimate casinos. He owes money to loan sharks connected to organized crime. The distinction was crucial. Miranda thought she was funding an affair, but she was actually laundering money for criminal enterprises. The federal implications would multiply her legal exposure exponentially. As evening approached, Aaron received updates from his various team members. Stuart Hunter reported that the financial restructuring was complete. Miranda would find that her access to Aaron's wealth had vanished overnight. Carl Welch confirmed that divorce papers were being prepared with terms that would shock Miranda's legal team. But the most interesting update came from Jimmy Nichols, a private investigator who specialized in background checks for Aaron's construction company. Jimmy had been researching Brian's activities and discovered something unexpected. Your stepson has been selling information about your business dealings, Jimmy reported. But not just to Seth. He's been in contact with competitors, union organizers, and at least 2 government investigators. Aaron felt a familiar coldness settle in his chest. Brian's betrayal went far beyond family disloyalty. It was corporate espionage that could have destroyed Aaron's business and put hundreds of people out of work. There's more, Jimmy continued. He's been using his access to your home office to photograph sensitive documents. Some of those photos ended up in the hands of people who've been trying to undermine your contract for years. The revelation added a new dimension to Aaron's plans. Brian wasn't just a spoiled child supporting his mother's affair. He was actively sabotaging the business that had paid for his education, his car, and his lifestyle. As Aaron reviewed all the intelligence gathered over the past week, he began to see the full scope of the conspiracy against him. Miranda, Seth, and Brian had been working together to destroy him systematically while positioning themselves to profit from the wreckage. They had underestimated him completely. Aaron had built his empire by understanding that every problem contained the seeds of its own solution. Every weakness in an enemy's plan created an opportunity for counterattack. Aaron opened his laptop and began typing detailed instructions for each member of his team. The plan he was implementing would unfold over several weeks, with each phase building on the previous one until his enemies found themselves trapped in a web of their own making. The first phase would target their finances and social standing. The second would expose their crimes and betrayals. The third would ensure they faced consequences that would last for years. Aaron had learned long ago that mercy was often mistaken for weakness, and forgiveness was frequently repaid with fresh betrayal. He had given Miranda, Seth, and Brian every opportunity to choose loyalty over greed, family over self-interest. They had made their choice. Now Aaron would show them the consequences of betraying someone who had clawed his way out of poverty and built an empire through sheer force of will. The foundation for their destruction was complete. Tomorrow, the real work would begin. Chapter 4. The Pressure Points. Miranda Caldwell woke up to discover that her credit cards had been canceled overnight. When she called the bank to complain, she was transferred to a supervisor who informed her that Mr. Haley had restructured all accounts and removed her as an authorized user. "That's impossible," Miranda shrieked into the phone. "I'm his wife. I have rights." "Ma'am, according to our records, these were business accounts that Mr. Haley personally guaranteed. He has every legal right to manage access to his own credit facilities. Miranda threw the phone across her bedroom, barely missing the mirror that reflected her rage-contorted face. She called Seth immediately, but his phone went straight to voicemail. What Miranda didn't know was that Seth was sitting in a parking garage across town, staring at two men who had paid him a very unfriendly visit. His gambling debts had come due, and his creditors weren't interested in excuses. 2 weeks, the larger man said, adjusting his brass knuckles. You get us our money in 2 weeks, or we start collecting in other ways. Seth's hands shook as he tried calling Miranda, but her phone was busy. He didn't know that Aaron's team had been monitoring his communications and had arranged for both problems to surface simultaneously. Meanwhile, Brian Raymond was having his own crisis at his downtown apartment. His BMW had been repossessed in the night, and his landlord was demanding 3 months of back rent that Brian couldn't pay. His mother's credit cards, which had been funding his lifestyle, were no longer working. This is all Aaron's fault, Brian muttered, throwing his clothes into garbage bags. His expensive wardrobe, paid for with Aaron's money, was all he had left of value. But Brian's problems were just beginning. At his part-time job as a consultant for his mother's social circle, he discovered that word had somehow spread about his disloyalty to Aaron. In the tight-knit business community Aaron had spent decades building, Brian found himself persona non grata overnight. Aaron watched the chaos unfold from his command center in the warehouse, where multiple screens showed surveillance feeds, news reports, and financial data. Crystal sat beside him, her healing arm no longer hindering her ability to coordinate the operation. Seth's creditors are increasing pressure, she reported, monitoring communications intercepts. He's desperate enough to do something stupid. That stupidity came sooner than expected. Seth broke into Miranda's house that afternoon, searching for jewelry and valuables he could liquidate quickly. What he found instead was Aaron, sitting calmly in the living room with a cup of coffee. Hello, Seth. Looking for something? Seth froze, a gold necklace halfway into his pocket. Miranda said I could. Miranda says a lot of things, Aaron replied, his voice conversational. Most of them lies. Would you like to sit down? We should talk. The conversation that followed was recorded by hidden cameras that Aaron's team had installed throughout the house. Seth, panicked about his debts and desperate for solutions, admitted to everything. The affair, the financial planning, the scheme to take Aaron's assets, even Brian's role as an informant. She promised me half of everything, Seth said, his desperation making him careless. The business, the houses, the investments. Miranda said you were stupid and weak, that you'd never see it coming. Aaron nodded sympathetically. And what did you promise her in return? A new life. Freedom from a husband who never appreciated her. Seth's voice took on a rehearsed quality, as if he'd practiced these lines. She deserves better than someone who just works all the time. I see. And Brian? What role does he play in this new life? Seth shifted uncomfortably. The kid's useful. He has access to your files, your computer. We needed someone inside to make sure we didn't miss anything valuable. Every word was being recorded in high definition, creating a permanent record of the conspiracy. Aaron had what he needed, but he wasn't finished yet. There's just one problem with your plan, Aaron said, still speaking in the same calm tone. You assumed I was stupid and weak. What if you were wrong? The realization dawned slowly on Seth's face as he noticed the cameras, the recording equipment, the fact that Aaron was completely relaxed despite catching him in the act of burglary. This was a setup, Seth whispered. This was justice, Aaron corrected. You're a career criminal who targets vulnerable women. Miranda isn't your first victim, and she wouldn't have been your last. Aaron stood up, his imposing frame casting a shadow over the trembling younger man. But she will be your last, because I'm going to make sure everyone knows exactly what you are. That evening, Aaron's team executed the next phase of the plan. The recorded confession was edited into a documentary-style presentation and sent to every member of Miranda's social circle, every client at Seth Gym, and every business associate who had ever dealt with Brian. The response was immediate and devastating. Miranda's country club friends stopped taking her calls. Seth's training clients canceled their sessions and demanded refunds. Brian's consulting work dried up as word spread about his corporate espionage. But Aaron wasn't content with social exile. He wanted complete destruction. The security footage of Seth burglarizing the house was delivered to the police, along with evidence of his fraud, gambling debts, and connections to organized crime. The audio recordings of Brian discussing corporate secrets were forwarded to federal investigators who had been monitoring Aaron's business for years, looking for any excuse to bring him down. Now those same investigators had evidence that Aaron was the victim, not the perpetrator, of corporate espionage. Miranda received divorce papers that evening, along with a complete accounting of her theft from family accounts. The documents, prepared by Carl Welch, were masterpieces of legal precision that left her with virtually no claim to Aaron's assets. "Irreconcilable differences," she read aloud, her voice rising with each word. "He's claiming irreconcilable differences because I disciplined my own daughter?" Brian, now homeless and facing federal investigation, tried to rally his mother. "We can fight this. We can expose his business dealings, his offshore accounts." "With what money?" Miranda snapped. "Our lawyer won't even take our calls without a retainer we can't pay." As mother and son faced the collapse of their schemes, Aaron was already planning the next phase. Financial and social destruction was satisfying, but he wanted them to understand the full consequences of their betrayal. The real pain was just beginning. Chapter 5. The Squeeze. The Riverside Hotel, where Miranda and Seth had conducted their affair, became the setting for Seth's downfall. Aaron had purchased the failing business through one of his shell companies, and the new management was very interested in investigating irregularities in their previous operations. Security footage from the past year was mysteriously discovered and turned over to law enforcement, showing Seth and Miranda's meetings, but also revealing something more damaging: Seth's drug transactions with hotel guests and staff. "We had no idea," the new manager told reporters as Channel 7 news cameras rolled. "When Mr. Haley's company acquired this property, we immediately began reviewing security procedures and discovered evidence of serious criminal activity." Seth watched the news report from a seedy motel room, his world collapsing around him. The drug charges were secondary to his real problem. His gambling creditors had seen the same news report and correctly concluded that he would never be able to pay them. Miranda fared no better. Her attempt to claim spousal support was demolished in court when Aaron's lawyers presented evidence of her theft, adultery, and abuse of Crystal. The judge, a woman with little patience for child abusers, awarded Aaron full custody of Crystal and ordered Miranda to pay restitution. "Your Honor," Miranda's court-appointed lawyer pleaded, "my client has no income and no assets with which to pay restitution." Then perhaps she should have considered that before stealing from her daughter's college fund and burning the child with a hot iron. Judge Diane Quinn replied coldly. Brian's situation was even worse. The federal investigation into his corporate espionage had expanded to include his connections to Seth's criminal activities. Prosecutors were offering him a plea deal that would require him to testify against his mother and Seth in exchange for a reduced sentence. "They want me to wear a wire," Brian told Miranda during one of their few remaining conversations. "They think you and Seth are part of some larger conspiracy." Miranda laughed bitterly. "Conspiracy? We couldn't even pull off a simple divorce without everything falling apart." What neither Miranda nor Brian understood was that their failures weren't due to bad luck or poor planning. They were the result of Aaron's systematic destruction of every foundation they had built their schemes upon. Aaron had used his business connections to ensure that Miranda couldn't find employment anywhere in the city. Seth's gym had fired him after clients complained about the criminal charges, and his personal training license was under review. Brian's reputation in the business community was so thoroughly destroyed that he couldn't even get hired as a delivery driver. But Aaron's masterpiece was yet to come. Through his media consultant Mark Mead, Aaron had been building a narrative about Seth as a serial predator who targeted vulnerable women. The story was picked up by national news outlets, with Miranda portrayed as Seth's latest victim rather than his willing accomplice. She was brainwashed by a master manipulator, one expert explained on television. These predators are skilled at identifying women going through difficult transitions and exploiting their emotional vulnerability. The narrative served Aaron's purposes perfectly. It painted Miranda as a victim rather than a villain, which made her actual crimes seem even more shocking when they were eventually revealed. Public sympathy for a brainwashed woman would quickly turn to disgust when people learned she had burned her own daughter. Seth, meanwhile, was dealing with more immediate problems. His creditors had escalated from threats to action, vandalizing his car and following him to his new job at a discount fitness center. When he tried to flee the city, he was arrested at the airport on the drug charges stemming from the hotel investigation. Bail is set at $500,000, the judge announced, knowing full well that Seth had no way to raise such an amount. From his jail cell, Seth tried to contact Miranda, hoping she might have access to funds that could help him. What he didn't know was that Miranda was facing her own legal crisis. Aaron had filed a civil lawsuit against Miranda for theft, fraud, and intentional infliction of emotional distress. The lawsuit, designed more for publicity than recovery, detailed every aspect of her betrayal and included graphic photos of Crystal's burn injuries. Local newspapers picked up the story, and Miranda found herself cast as a child abuser and gold digger who had stolen from her own daughter to fund an affair with a career criminal. The evidence shows a pattern of calculated cruelty, Aaron's lawyer told reporters. Ms. Caldwell didn't just betray her husband. She systematically abused and exploited the children in her care. Miranda's attempts to generate sympathy were undermined by her own recorded words, which Aaron's team strategically leaked to media outlets. Her laughter as Crystal writhed in pain, her casual dismissal of the injury, and her cruel comments about her daughter's worth destroyed any chance of public support. Brian's situation deteriorated further when prosecutors offered him immunity in exchange for testimony against his mother. The federal charges related to corporate espionage carried potential sentences of up to 20 years, making cooperation his only realistic option. "She's my mother," Brian protested to his lawyer. "She's also the reason you're facing federal charges," the lawyer replied bluntly. "She encouraged you to steal from the man who raised you, educated you, and treated you as his own son. Now that man is willing to let you walk away if you tell the truth about what happened." The truth, Brian discovered, was more damaging than he had realized. Aaron's investigators had documented every aspect of the conspiracy, from the initial affair to the planned asset seizure. Brian's cooperation would simply confirm what Aaron already knew and had extensively documented. As the legal proceedings moved forward, Aaron continued his campaign of systematic destruction. He used his influence to ensure that Miranda's story reached the attention of child welfare organizations, women's advocacy groups, and victim rights activists. The irony was deliberate. Miranda had expected to portray herself as a victim of Aaron's alleged abuse, but instead found herself condemned by the very groups she had hoped would support her. Seth, still in jail and facing mounting pressure from both prosecutors and creditors, finally agreed to plead guilty to all charges in exchange for protective custody. His confession included detailed testimony about Miranda's role in planning the asset seizure and Brian's corporate espionage activities. "She wasn't a victim," Seth told prosecutors, abandoning his former lover to save himself. "She was the ringleader. The whole thing was her idea from the beginning." Aaron watched the dominoes fall from his office, overlooking the city he had helped build. Each revelation, each betrayal, each desperate attempt to escape consequences only deepened the hole his enemies had dug for themselves. But he wasn't finished yet. The final phase of his plan would ensure that their destruction was permanent and complete. Chapter 6: The Revelation. The courtroom was packed with media, social activists, and curious onlookers as Miranda Caldwell's trial began. Aaron sat in the front row beside Crystal, whose healed arm bore only a faint scar, but whose testimony would be devastating. District Attorney Freddie Mullen had built his case methodically, using the mountain of evidence Aaron's team had gathered. The charges included child abuse, theft, fraud, and conspiracy, a combination that could result in decades in prison. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury," Mullen began his opening statement, This case is about the systematic abuse and exploitation of a family by someone they trusted completely. The defendant didn't just burn her daughter with a hot iron. She orchestrated a complex scheme to destroy the man who had provided for her family for 15 years. Miranda's defense attorney, an overworked public defender named Guadalupe Green, tried to maintain the narrative that Miranda had been manipulated by Seth. But that strategy crumbled when prosecutors revealed recordings of Miranda discussing the scheme before she had ever met Seth. The first bombshell came from Brian's testimony. In exchange for immunity, he had agreed to reveal everything, including details that Aaron hadn't previously known. She started planning to leave Aaron about 2 years ago, Brian testified, avoiding his mother's furious glare. But she wanted to make sure she got as much money as possible. She researched his business, talked to lawyers, even hired a private investigator to look for evidence of affairs or financial crimes. The revelation that Miranda had been planning her betrayal for years, long before Seth appeared, destroyed any sympathy the jury might have felt for her. But the most shocking testimony came from an unexpected source. Ethel Lancaster, Crystal's biological grandmother, who had remained silent for years about her daughter-in-law's true nature. "Miranda called me 3 years ago," the elderly woman testified, her voice shaking with emotion. "She wanted to know if Crystal had any inheritance coming from her father's side. When I told her there wasn't anything significant, she said, 'Then the little bitch is worthless to me.'" The courtroom erupted at this revelation. Miranda had been calculating Crystal's financial value to her even before the affair began, treating her stepdaughter as nothing more than a potential asset. Crystal's own testimony was the most powerful moment of the trial. She described not just the burning incident, but years of emotional abuse, financial exploitation, and deliberate sabotage of her education and career goals. "She told me I wasn't smart enough for college," Crystal said, her voice steady despite her tears. "She said Aaron was wasting money on my education because I'd never amount to anything. But she was spending that same money on clothes, jewelry, and trips with Seth." Aaron watched Miranda's face as Crystal spoke, seeing no remorse or regret, only anger at being exposed. Even facing prison, Miranda couldn't summon any genuine emotion for the daughter she had tortured. The prosecution's case was devastating, but Aaron had one final surprise prepared. Through his connections in law enforcement, he had learned that Seth's criminal history went back much further than anyone had realized. Detective Reginald Drake took the stand to reveal that Seth had been connected to at least 5 other cases involving fraud against older women, including one that had resulted in a woman's suicide when she lost her life savings. The defendant's affair wasn't just adultery, Drake testified. It was part of a pattern of financial predation that has destroyed lives across 3 states. The revelation that Miranda had unknowingly partnered with a serial killer of dreams, someone whose schemes had literally driven a woman to suicide, shocked even Aaron. He had expected to find a garden-variety predator, not someone whose crimes had such devastating consequences. Miranda's lawyer tried desperately to salvage the case by arguing that her client had been manipulated by a master criminal, but the recorded conversations between Miranda and Seth told a different story. In them, Miranda was clearly the dominant partner, directing Seth's actions and making strategic decisions. She wasn't a victim, Seth testified via video link from federal prison, having already been convicted on multiple counts. "She was smarter than me, more ruthless. The iron thing was all her idea." She said Crystal needed to learn respect. The jury deliberated for less than 4 hours. When they returned, their verdict was swift and decisive, guilty on all counts. Judge Quinn's sentencing was equally harsh. "Ms. Caldwell, you have shown a level of cruelty and calculation that shocks the conscience. You burned your own daughter, stole from her future, and conspired to destroy the man who treated you and your children as family. The court sentences you to 25 years in prison without possibility of parole for 15 years. Miranda collapsed as the sentence was read, finally understanding that her schemes had not just failed, they had destroyed her completely. Aaron felt no satisfaction in her tears. Justice had been served, but the damage to his family could never be fully repaired. As they left the courthouse, Crystal squeezed Aaron's hand. "Thank you," she said simply, "for everything." Aaron looked at the young woman who had emerged stronger from her ordeal, now preparing to start nursing school with his full support. "You're my daughter," he said. "That means something to me, even if it didn't to her." The media coverage of the trial had an unexpected consequence. Several other women came forward with stories of being targeted by men using Seth's methods. Aaron found himself inadvertently leading a campaign to expose financial predators who targeted vulnerable women. But privately, Aaron was already moving on to the next phase of his life. With Miranda and Seth in prison and Brian facing his own consequences, he was free to build something new with Crystal, a family based on loyalty, respect, and genuine affection. The old Aaron might have felt guilty about the ruthless efficiency of his revenge, but that Aaron had been too trusting, too forgiving. The new Aaron understood that some betrayals could never be forgiven, and some people deserved exactly what they brought upon themselves. Justice, Aaron had learned, wasn't always pretty, but it was always necessary. Chapter 7. The Reckoning. 6 months after Miranda's sentencing, Aaron stood in the construction site of the Crystal Haley Medical Center, a trauma treatment facility he was building in his daughter's honor. The irony wasn't lost on him that a building dedicated to healing would rise from the ashes of such destruction. Crystal had thrived since the trial, excelling in her nursing program and working part-time at the Children's Hospital. The burn scar on her arm had faded to a thin white line, but the strength she had gained from surviving her ordeal was permanent. The Psychological Evaluation Center will be on the 3rd floor, Crystal explained to Aaron as they reviewed architectural plans, specifically designed for children who've suffered abuse. Aaron nodded, proud of how his daughter had transformed her trauma into purpose. The medical center would serve as a permanent reminder that suffering could create something meaningful if channeled correctly. Brian had fared differently. After serving 18 months in federal prison for corporate espionage, he was released to a world that had moved on without him. His cooperation with prosecutors had kept him from a longer sentence, but it had also branded him as a traitor in both legitimate and criminal circles. Aaron had ensured that Brian's cooperation became public knowledge, making him unemployable in any field requiring trust or discretion. The young man who had once lived luxuriously on Aaron's generosity now worked minimum wage jobs and lived in a studio apartment on the wrong side of town. "He called me yesterday," Crystal told Aaron as they drove home from the construction site. "He wanted to know if you'd ever forgive him." Aaron's expression didn't change. "What did you tell him?" "The truth. That forgiveness has to be earned, and he's never even apologized for what he did to either of us." Brian's downfall had been more complete than even Aaron had planned. The federal conviction made him ineligible for most professional licenses, and his betrayal of Aaron had destroyed his reputation in the business community. More importantly, his testimony against his mother had fractured his remaining family relationships. Miranda's relatives had cut all contact with Brian after learning the extent of his cooperation with prosecutors. In trying to save himself, he had lost both his adoptive and biological families, leaving him truly alone. Seth's fate had been even harsher. His connections to organized crime made prison a dangerous place for him, and his cooperation with prosecutors had made him a target. He spent most of his time in protective custody, isolated from other inmates, and facing decades behind bars. But Aaron's most satisfying victory wasn't the destruction of his enemies. It was the construction of something better in their place. The Haley Foundation, established with Crystal as co-director, had become a major force in supporting abuse victims and funding education for underprivileged children. The foundation's work ensured that Aaron's wealth would create positive change long after he was gone. Aaron had also restructured his business to include employee ownership programs and community investment initiatives. The company that Miranda had tried to loot was now benefiting hundreds of families and strengthening the community Aaron called home. "There's something else," Crystal said as they reached home, a new house Aaron had built for them, free from the memories of Miranda's abuse. "I've been accepted to the pediatric nursing program at Johns Hopkins." Aaron felt a surge of pride that surpassed any business success he had ever achieved. Crystal had not only survived her ordeal, but was positioning herself to help other children who face similar trauma. "When do you start?" he asked. "Next fall. But I want to finish the medical center project first. I want to see it completed." That evening, Aaron sat in his study reviewing reports from Todd Mayer, who continued to monitor Miranda and Seth's situations. Both were adapting poorly to prison life, and their appeals had been unanimously rejected by higher courts. Miranda had lost significant weight and was receiving psychological treatment for depression. Her request for early release had been denied, and her earliest possible parole date was still a decade away. Seth faced even grimmer prospects. His gambling debts had followed him into prison, and his creditors had connections throughout the correctional system. He lived in constant fear, dependent on guards for protection, and facing the possibility that his debts might be collected through violence. But the most interesting development involved Brian. Todd's surveillance revealed that the young man had been attempting to reconnect with his biological father, Thomas Lancaster, who had abandoned the family years earlier. "Thomas wants nothing to do with him," Todd reported. Apparently, Brian tried to convince his father to help him get revenge against you. Thomas called Brian a pathetic loser and hung up on him. Aaron wasn't surprised. Brian had spent years believing he was entitled to loyalty and support from people he had betrayed. The reality that actions had consequences was still foreign to him. "There's one more thing," Todd continued. "Brian has been trying to contact journalists about writing a tell-all book about your criminal empire. He's claiming you framed him and his mother." Aaron smiled coldly. "And how is that working out for him?" "No one's interested. Your reputation in the community is too strong, and Brian's credibility is too damaged. Plus, he signed confidentiality agreements as part of his plea deal that would land him back in federal prison if he violates them." The final irony was perfect. Brian's desperation for revenge against Aaron was limited by the very cooperation agreement that had saved him from a longer prison sentence. He was trapped by his own choices, unable to move forward or backward. As Aaron prepared for bed, he reflected on how completely the landscape had changed. A year ago, he had been a successful but naive man who believed that love and generosity would be returned in kind. Now he was a strategist who understood that trust was earned, loyalty was tested, and betrayal was met with overwhelming force. Crystal found him on the balcony, looking out over the city lights. "Any regrets?" she asked. Aaron considered the question carefully. "About the methods? No. About the necessity? Yes. I regret that it had to come to this. Do you think they've learned anything?" Aaron shook his head. "Miranda blames everyone but herself. Seth is focused on survival. Brian still thinks he's the victim. None of them understand that they created their own destruction." Crystal nodded, understanding that some people were incapable of growth or redemption. "Then you made the right choice." As they stood together in comfortable silence, Aaron knew that his campaign of justice had accomplished more than revenge. It had revealed the true character of everyone involved. Miranda, Seth, and Brian had shown themselves to be exactly what Aaron now knew them to be: selfish, cruel, and fundamentally weak people who would betray anyone for personal gain. Aaron had learned to be something different, strong enough to protect what mattered, smart enough to anticipate threats, and ruthless enough to eliminate them completely. The game was over. Aaron had won not just victory, but transformation. Chapter 8. The New Order. 2 years after Miranda's conviction, Aaron stood before the city council as they voted unanimously to name the new Children's Crisis Center in Crystal's honor. The Crystal Haley Center for Child Advocacy had become the premier facility in the region for treating young abuse victims, funded entirely by Aaron's foundation. "Mr. Haley," Mayor Alyssa Holder said as she presented him with the key to the city, "your generosity has transformed how our community protects its most vulnerable citizens." Aaron accepted the honor, knowing that his reputation had been completely rehabilitated. The narrative of the wronged father who had protected his daughter and exposed dangerous criminals had overshadowed any questions about his methods. Crystal, now finishing her pediatric nursing degree, had become a public advocate for abuse victims. Her story, burning, betrayal, and ultimate triumph, inspired other survivors to come forward and seek help. The most important thing I learned, Crystal told a conference of social workers, is that healing requires justice. Victims can't move forward when their abusers face no consequences. Brian watched Crystal's speech on a laptop in his cramped apartment, his face twisted with resentment. At 27, he looked older than his age, worn down by minimum wage jobs and the constant struggle to survive without the support system he had destroyed. His attempts to rebuild his life had failed repeatedly. Every job application that required a background check revealed his federal conviction. Every potential relationship ended when partners learned about his betrayal of his family. Even his attempts to change his name had been blocked by legal restrictions related to his conviction. Brian had recently been evicted from his apartment and was living in his car, a 15-year-old Honda that had replaced the BMW Aaron once provided. His descent into homelessness seemed inevitable unless something changed. Miranda's situation was equally bleak, but more stable. Prison had stripped away her pretenses and forced her to confront the reality of her choices. She worked in the prison laundry for 17 cents an hour and spent her evenings in her cell, writing letters to Aaron and Crystal that were never sent. She talks about them constantly. Her cellmate, a woman named Robin Hahn, told the prison counselor. She's convinced that if she could just explain herself, they'd forgive her and take her back. The delusion that Miranda maintained, that she was the victim of a misunderstanding rather than the architect of her own destruction, had become a form of mental protection. Accepting responsibility for burning her daughter and destroying her family would have required her to acknowledge a level of evil she couldn't face. Seth's prison experience had been more harrowing. His protective custody status made him a target for guards and inmates alike, and his gambling debts had followed him behind bars. He lived in constant fear, knowing that his creditors had connections throughout the prison system. He's basically serving a death sentence, his lawyer told reporters. The protective custody unit is just delaying the inevitable. Aaron monitored these developments through his network of contacts, but felt no sympathy for any of his former family members. They had made their choices when they chose betrayal over loyalty, cruelty over compassion. The business Aaron had built continued to thrive under his leadership, but he had restructured it to prevent future betrayals. Key positions were filled by people whose loyalty had been tested over years, and access to sensitive information was strictly controlled. More importantly, Aaron had learned to trust his instincts about people. The signs of Miranda's true nature had been there from the beginning. Her casual cruelty to service workers, her obsession with social status, her lack of empathy for others' struggles. Aaron had ignored these red flags because he wanted to believe in the family he was building. Now he understood that character was revealed through actions, not words, and that past behavior was the most reliable predictor of future choices. "You've become harder," Crystal observed one evening as they reviewed foundation business. "Not cruel, but more realistic about people." Aaron nodded. "Experience teaches lessons that theory never could. I learned that some people will take everything you give them and still want more." The lesson had applications beyond his personal life. Aaron's business dealings had become more cautious, his contracts more detailed, his trust more carefully earned. He had learned to distinguish between partners and parasites, between temporary setbacks and fundamental character flaws. The most unexpected development had been Aaron's emergence as a mentor to other men facing similar betrayals. His story had resonated with countless husbands and fathers who had been taken advantage of by people they trusted. The key, Aaron told a support group of divorced men, is understanding that forgiveness doesn't require reconciliation. You can forgive someone for your own peace of mind while still protecting yourself from future harm. Several group members had been pressured by family and friends to forgive and forget spouses who had betrayed them. Aaron's example showed them that they could move forward without compromising their principles or enabling continued abuse. Forgiveness without consequences is just enabling, Aaron continued. Real forgiveness requires accountability, and accountability requires consequences. The support group had grown into a network of men who helped each other navigate divorce, custody battles, and financial disputes. Aaron's influence had created a community of people who understood that strength wasn't measured by how much abuse you could tolerate, but by how effectively you could protect what mattered. As Aaron's reputation as a protector and advocate grew, he began receiving requests for help from people facing situations similar to his own. The foundation expanded its mission to include support for anyone being exploited by family members or trusted friends. "We're not vigilantes," Aaron explained to his staff. "We're educators. We help people understand their legal rights, their financial options, and their personal boundaries." But Aaron's definition of education was broader than most people's. When a widow contacted the foundation about her son's theft of her retirement savings, Aaron's team didn't just provide legal referrals. They conducted a comprehensive investigation that revealed the son's gambling addiction and drug dealing. When a single mother reported that her ex-husband was coaching their children to lie in custody proceedings, Aaron's investigators documented the manipulation and presented evidence that led to supervised visitation requirements. In each case, Aaron applied the same principles he had used against Miranda, Seth, and Brian. Comprehensive intelligence gathering, strategic patience, and overwhelming response to confirmed threats. "You're building an empire," Crystal observed as she reviewed the foundation's expanded operations. "I'm building protection," Aaron corrected, "for people who can't protect themselves." The distinction was important to Aaron. His campaign against Miranda had been personal revenge justified by their crimes. The foundation's work was preventive justice designed to stop future victims from suffering similar betrayals. But the methods were often identical: thorough investigation, strategic planning, and relentless execution until threats were neutralized completely. Aaron had learned that mercy was often mistaken for weakness, and weakness invited further exploitation. The world contained predators who viewed kindness as opportunity and trust as vulnerability. Against such people, overwhelming force was the only effective deterrent. The new Aaron Haley was no longer vulnerable to betrayal because he no longer relied on others' goodwill for his security. He had built systems, networks, and resources that could function independently of any individual's loyalty. It was a lonely form of strength, but it was unbreakable. Chapter 9. The Final Verdict. 5 years after the iron burned Crystal's arm, Aaron stood in the cemetery where his adoptive parents were buried, reflecting on how completely his life had changed. The naive man who had once believed that love and generosity would be naturally reciprocated was gone, replaced by someone who understood that respect was earned through strength. Crystal joined him at the gravesite, now a licensed pediatric nurse working at the children's hospital Aaron had endowed. She carried herself with confidence that came from surviving the worst betrayal imaginable and emerging stronger. "I got a letter from Brian yesterday," she said, handing Aaron an envelope. "He's asking for money." Aaron read the letter without surprise. Brian had been living in his car for 3 months and was desperate enough to beg for help from the family he had betrayed. The letter was full of self-pity and vague promises of changed behavior, but contained no genuine acknowledgement of his crimes or apology for his betrayal. "He says he's learned his lesson," Crystal continued. "He promises he's different now." Aaron tore the letter in half and dropped the pieces in a trash can. People like Brian only learn temporary lessons. As soon as the pressure is off, they revert to their true nature. The decision to refuse help wasn't cruel, it was educational. Brian needed to understand that actions had permanent consequences and that betrayal destroyed trust forever. Any assistance from Aaron would only teach Brian that his victims were weak enough to be exploited repeatedly. Miranda's situation had grown more desperate as her appeals continued to fail. Her lawyer had approached Aaron's representatives multiple times, suggesting that his testimony about her character might help with parole hearings. Aaron's response was always the same. Miranda had revealed her character through her actions, and no amount of legal maneuvering could change that reality. "She's still blaming everyone but herself," Crystal observed. "Her letters to me are full of complaints about the prison conditions and how unfairly she's been treated." Aaron wasn't surprised. Miranda's narcissism made it impossible for her to accept responsibility for her choices. She would spend the remainder of her sentence convinced that she was the victim of a conspiracy rather than the architect of her own destruction. Seth had finally met the violent end that everyone had anticipated. His gambling creditors had reached him despite protective custody, and he was found dead in his cell under circumstances that were officially ruled as suicide but clearly indicated otherwise. No great loss, Todd Mayer had reported when delivering the news. The world is safer without predators like him. Aaron felt no satisfaction in Seth's death, but no sadness either. The man had chosen to live as a parasite, destroying vulnerable people for personal gain. His violent end was simply the logical conclusion of a life spent making enemies. The foundation Aaron had built continued to expand its reach, helping hundreds of families avoid the kind of exploitation his own family had suffered. The work had given Aaron a sense of purpose that went beyond personal success or revenge. "We're opening a new facility in Portland," Crystal reported as they drove home from the cemetery. "A residential treatment center for children who've been abused by family members." Aaron nodded, pleased that his daughter had found a way to transform her trauma into positive change. Crystal's strength came not from forgetting what had happened to her, but from using that experience to protect others. "Any word from your grandmother?" Aaron asked. Crystal smiled. "She's doing well. Still grateful that you stood up for me when no one else would." Ethel Lancaster had become a strong supporter of the foundation after witnessing how Aaron had protected Crystal from further abuse. The elderly woman often spoke publicly about the importance of believing children and holding abusers accountable, regardless of family relationships. As they reached home, a fortress-like compound Aaron had built with state-of-the-art security systems, Crystal brought up a topic they had been discussing for months. "I've been thinking about changing my name legally," she said. "From Lancaster to Haley. You've been more of a father to me than anyone else ever was." Aaron felt a warmth that no business success had ever provided. "Are you sure? It's a big decision. You protected me when my own mother tried to destroy me," Crystal replied. "You've supported my dreams and helped me become the person I wanted to be. That makes you my real father, regardless of biology." The adoption paperwork was filed the following week, making Crystal officially Aaron's daughter in law as well as in love. The ceremony was small but meaningful, attended by friends and colleagues who had watched their relationship strengthen through adversity. Brian learned about the adoption through news coverage and sent another letter, this one filled with bitter accusations about Aaron stealing his sister. The letter revealed that Brian still viewed Crystal as property to be claimed rather than a person with agency to make her own choices. Aaron shared the letter with Crystal, who laughed at her former brother's delusions. He still doesn't understand that respect is earned, not inherited. The distinction was crucial. Brian had believed that his biological connection to Crystal gave him certain rights and privileges, regardless of how he treated her. Aaron had learned that true family bonds were built through loyalty, sacrifice, and mutual support, qualities that biology couldn't provide. As Aaron reviewed his empire from his office overlooking the city, he reflected on the completeness of his victory. Miranda would spend the next decade in prison, her social standing and financial security permanently destroyed. Seth was dead, his schemes dying with him. Brian was homeless and unemployable, facing a lifetime of consequences for his betrayals. More importantly, Aaron had built something better from the ashes of their destruction. The foundation helped hundreds of families avoid similar exploitation. The medical center treated thousands of patients annually. The business employed hundreds of people and contributed millions to the local economy. Crystal had not only survived her ordeal, but had transformed it into strength that would help other victims for decades to come. Aaron had learned to distinguish between genuine loyalty and convenient opportunism, between character and performance. The final lesson of his experience was the most important. Forgiveness was not weakness, but it required wisdom. Some people deserved second chances, but others had demonstrated fundamental character flaws that made trust impossible. Aaron had forgiven Miranda, Seth, and Brian in the sense that he no longer carried anger about their betrayals. But forgiveness didn't require him to enable further abuse or pretend that their crimes hadn't revealed their true nature. Do you ever wonder how things might have been different? Crystal asked during one of their evening conversations. Aaron considered the question carefully. If Miranda had been honest about her feelings, if Seth had been a decent person, if Brian had chosen loyalty over greed, we might still be a family. But we would have been living a lie, and the truth would have emerged eventually. The betrayal had been painful, but ultimately liberating. Aaron no longer had to pretend that people loved him when they merely used him. He no longer had to invest in relationships with people who viewed him as a resource rather than a person. "I'm grateful it happened," Crystal said, surprising Aaron with her words. "Not for the pain, but for the truth. Now I know who really cares about me and who I can trust completely." Aaron smiled at his daughter's wisdom. She had learned at 23 what had taken him 52 years to understand, that authentic relationships were built on truth, not convenience, and that protecting oneself from exploitation was a form of self-respect, not selfishness. As they sat together in comfortable silence, Aaron knew that his campaign of justice had accomplished everything he had hoped. His enemies had been defeated completely, but more importantly, he had discovered who he really was when pushed to his limits. He was not the forgiving fool that Miranda had counted on exploiting. He was not the weak stepfather that Brian had expected to manipulate. He was Aaron Haley, a man who protected what mattered, who rewarded loyalty, and who made his enemies regret underestimating him. The iron's mark on Crystal's arm had faded to invisibility, but the strength they had both gained from surviving betrayal would last forever. They had learned that family wasn't defined by blood or law, but by choice, the choice to stand together when the world tried to tear them apart. In the end, Aaron's victory wasn't just about defeating his enemies. It was about discovering that he was strong enough to survive their worst, smart enough to outmaneuver their schemes, and wise enough to build something better from the ruins of their betrayal. The game was over. Aaron had won completely, and unlike his enemies, he would never have to look over his shoulder, because he had learned to distinguish between friends and predators, between love and exploitation. He was finally free. And there you have it. Another story comes to an end. What did you think? I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments below. If you enjoy this story, consider joining our community by subscribing. It means the world to us. For more stories like this one, check out the recommended videos on screen. And I'll see you there. Welcome back to another episode of Infidelity Tales Lab. We're thankful for your continued viewership. Before we begin, tell us, where in the world are you watching from? We love knowing our global reach. Now, let's dive into today's story. Chapter 1. The Perfect Facade. Robert Kane stood at the floor-to-ceiling windows of his corner office, watching the Seattle skyline shimmer in the afternoon rain. At 42, he had built Kane Security Solutions from nothing into a multi-million-dollar empire, specializing in high-end surveillance and protection services for the city's elite. His reflection showed a man who had earned every gray hair threading through his dark brown hair, lean, sharp-eyed, with calloused hands that spoke of his journey from street kid to boardroom. 20 years ago, he'd been nobody, an orphan who aged out of the foster system, sleeping in his beat-up Camaro and working construction by day while attending community college at night. That's where he'd met Diana Walsh, a stunning blonde from old Seattle money, studying art history because she could afford to pursue passions instead of paychecks. She'd been slumming it, fascinated by his rough edges and determination. "You're going to be somebody important," she'd whispered in those early days, her fingers tracing the scars on his knuckles from countless fights defending himself on the streets. "I can feel it now," as he watched her BMW pull into their Bellevue mansion's circular driveway through the security monitors he'd installed throughout their property. Bobby wondered when that admiration had curdled into contempt. Diana stepped out wearing a designer dress that cost more than most people's monthly salary, her movements graceful and calculated. She was still beautiful at 38, but there was something cold in her blue eyes now, something that had been growing for years. His phone buzzed, a text from his father, William Kane, the only person who believed in him when he had nothing. "Dinner Sunday. Got some news to share." Bobby smiled genuinely for the first time that day. William had been a longshoreman who'd found Bobby sleeping in his car in the harbor parking lot 23 years ago. Instead of calling the cops, the gruff 60-year-old had offered him a job, a couch, and eventually, something Bobby had never had, a real father. The office door opened without a knock. His assistant, Patricia Hayes, a sharp-eyed woman in her 50s who'd been with him since the company's founding. "Your wife called," she said, her tone carefully neutral. "She'll be late for dinner again. Some charity committee meeting." Bobby's jaw tightened. Diana's charity work had become increasingly time-consuming over the past year, often running until late evening. He'd initially admired her dedication to helping underprivileged children, but lately, something felt off about these frequent absences. "Patricia," he said slowly, "I need you to run a comprehensive background check." "On who?" "Everyone involved with the Harbor Children's Foundation. Board members, volunteers, donors. Everyone." Patricia raised an eyebrow, but nodded. She learned not to question Bobby's instincts. They'd kept the company ahead of threats and competition for years. "How deep do you want me to go?" "Deep enough to find what they don't want found." As Patricia left, Bobby returned to the window. His reflection stared back, but now he saw something different. The calculating look of a predator who'd caught an interesting scent. He'd built his fortune by reading people, by seeing the tells that revealed their true nature. Diana had been displaying tells for months. Secret phone calls, unexplained absences, a new interest in her appearance, and most tellingly, a sudden coldness toward their intimate life. His phone rang. William again. "Bobby, you free to talk?" "Always, Dad." "Listen, I've been thinking about what we discussed last month. About making sure you're protected if anything happens to me." Bobby frowned. At 75, William was still sharp as a tack, but he'd been talking more about mortality lately. "Dad, you're not going anywhere. You're too stubborn." William chuckled, but there was something serious in his voice. "Maybe so, but a man's got to plan. I'm updating my will this week. That property portfolio we discussed, the warehouses, the apartment buildings, the commercial real estate, it's all going to you. Diana's a good girl, but this is Kane family business." The property portfolio. Bobby had helped his father build it over the years, using his connections and business acumen to guide investments. It was worth nearly $8 million now, and Bobby had never thought much about inheritance. William was like a force of nature, seemingly indestructible. "Why are you bringing this up now?" "Just a feeling." "And Bobby, I'm doing this right. Everything's going through Arthur Hoffman. You remember him, the lawyer who helped with your incorporation papers. This will be ironclad. No loopholes, no ambiguity." After hanging up, Bobby stared at his reflection again. Two suspicious situations in one day. Diana's mysterious absences and William's sudden urgency about his will. In his line of work, coincidences were usually conspiracies waiting to be exposed. He picked up his secure phone and dialed a number he rarely used. "Marcus? It's Bobby Kane. I need a favor." Marcus Riley answered on the first ring. A former SEAL who worked freelance security, Marcus owed Bobby several favors from jobs over the years. "What do you need?" "Surveillance on my wife. Full package, GPS tracking, phone monitoring, the works. Can you handle it quietly?" "How quietly?" "Ghost protocol. If she's doing what I think she's doing, I don't want her to know I know until I'm ready to act." "Consider it done. When do you want to start?" Bobby watched Diana's BMW disappear down the street toward another late charity meeting. Tonight. Chapter 2. The Truth Unveiled. 3 weeks later, Bobby sat in his home office at 2 a.m., surrounded by photographs, phone records, and surveillance reports that painted a picture of betrayal so complete it took his breath away. Marcus had delivered everything. Location data, recorded conversations, even video footage that left no room for interpretation. Diana wasn't just cheating. She was conducting a full-scale affair with Trevor Mills, the 34-year-old director of the Harbor Children's Foundation. The same Trevor Mills whose background check had revealed a disturbing pattern. 3 previous relationships with married benefactors, each ending with significant financial settlements and mysterious donations to his organization. But it was worse than simple adultery. The recorded conversations revealed the true scope of their betrayal. Once the old man dies, She'll inherit everything. Trevor's voice crackled through the speakers. We just need to make sure she's positioned as the grieving daughter-in-law. Bobby trusts her completely. William's been talking about updating his will, Diana replied, her voice cold and calculating. He keeps saying it's all going to Bobby, but legally, as his wife, I should have rights to community property claims. Not if it's separate property acquired before marriage. But there are ways around that, especially if Bobby were to have an accident before he can contest anything. Bobby's blood ran cold as he heard his wife, the woman he'd loved for 20 years, discussing his potential murder with casual indifference. Trevor, we can't be too obvious. Bobby's paranoid about security. He's got cameras everywhere, contacts in law enforcement. If something happens to him, people will ask questions. Then we make it look natural. Heart attack, car accident, something untraceable. I know people who specialize in that kind of problem solving. The recording continued, detailing plans that made Bobby's stomach turn. They'd been monitoring William's health, waiting for the right moment. Trevor had apparently researched untraceable poisons, discussing methods that would appear to be natural deaths for both father and son. But the final betrayal came in Diana's voice, stripped of all pretense. 20 years I've wasted playing the supportive wife to that street trash. Do you know what it's like pretending to love someone so beneath you? He thinks Williams saved him, but all that old man did was delay the inevitable. Bobby was born nothing, and he'll die nothing. At least this way, his death will serve a purpose. Bobby turned off the recording and stared at his hands. They weren't shaking. That surprised him. Instead, he felt a cold calm settling over him. The same feeling he'd had in those early days when bigger, stronger men had tried to break him. The difference was that now he had resources, connections, and most importantly, time to plan. His phone buzzed, a text from William. Doctor wants to run some tests. Feeling under the weather lately. Don't worry, probably just getting old. Bobby's blood turned to ice. He immediately called Marcus. I need a full medical surveillance team on my father, starting now. Someone may be trying to poison him. Jesus, Bobby. How sure are you? Sure enough to kill anyone who touches him. Within hours, Marcus had arranged for a discreet medical team to monitor William's condition while Bobby's security specialist swept the old man's apartment for toxins. What they found confirmed his worst fears. Traces of thallium in William's coffee maker, a slow-acting poison that mimicked the symptoms of natural aging and illness. Bobby stared at the lab results, his hands finally beginning to shake with rage. They weren't just planning to kill him. They were already murdering his father. He called Arthur Hoffman, William's attorney, and arranged an emergency meeting. Arthur, a distinguished man in his 60s who'd known the Kane family for years, listened grimly as Bobby explained the situation. We need to accelerate Williams' will update, Bobby said. And I need you to add some special provisions. What kind of provisions? Bobby's smile was sharp as a blade. The kind that will destroy anyone who tries to steal from the Kane family. Over the next week, Bobby orchestrated a complex plan. First, he had Williams' food and water supply carefully monitored and replaced, stopping the poisoning while making it appear that the old man's health was continuing to decline. Medical Confederates provided false test results showing Williams' condition as terminal, giving him perhaps weeks to live. Diana played her part perfectly, showing fake concern while secretly celebrating with Trevor. Bobby watched through hidden cameras as they discussed their timeline, how they would comfort each other through the tragic loss of William, and how they would handle Bobby's subsequent accident. The irony wasn't lost on him. Diana thought she was manipulating a street kid who'd gotten lucky. She had no idea she was playing chess with someone who'd learned to think 15 moves ahead. Meanwhile, Bobby used his security connections to build a comprehensive dossier on Trevor Mills. The man wasn't just a serial seducer of wealthy women. He was connected to a network of criminals who specialized in inheritance fraud, elder abuse, and when necessary, murder for hire. Trevor's organization was a front, his charity work a cover for identifying and exploiting vulnerable wealthy targets. But Bobby's investigation revealed something even more useful. Trevor had made enemies. Serious enemies. His previous schemes had left a trail of victims, including Anthony Carrera, a Chicago businessman whose wife had died in a suspicious accident after becoming involved with Trevor. Anthony had spent 2 years trying to prove Trevor's involvement and had accumulated significant evidence that law enforcement had dismissed due to lack of concrete proof. Bobby made a call. "Mr. Carrera? My name is Robert Kane. I believe we have a mutual problem." 3 days later, Anthony arrived in Seattle, carrying a briefcase full of evidence and a burning desire for justice. Together, they crafted a plan that would give both men what they wanted: absolute destruction of Trevor Mills and everyone connected to him. "This has to be perfect," Bobby told Anthony as they sat in his secure office. "No loose ends, no escape routes. When we move, it has to be total." Anthony's smile was grim. "I've been waiting 2 years for this conversation. Trevor Mills destroyed my family. Now we destroy him." Chapter 3. The Setup. William Kane's funeral was scheduled for a gray Thursday morning in November. Of course, William wasn't actually dead. He was safely hidden in a private medical facility outside the city, protected by Bobby's best security team and enjoying the show via encrypted video feeds. The thallium had been flushed from his system, and his health was rapidly improving, though officially he died peacefully in his sleep after a brief illness. Diana played the grieving daughter-in-law perfectly, choosing a black Armani dress that managed to be both appropriately somber and subtly seductive. Bobby watched her performance with detached admiration. She really was talented at deception. Too bad for her that she'd chosen to deceive the wrong man. The funeral service was small and intimate, attended by William's old friends from the docks, some of Bobby's business associates, and of course, Trevor Mills, who appeared as Diana's supportive friend during her time of grief. Bobby noticed how Trevor's hand lingered on Diana's lower back during the reception, a gesture supposedly comforting but clearly possessive. "I'm so sorry for your loss," Trevor said to Bobby with perfect sincerity. "William was a remarkable man. Diana's told me so much about how he mentored you." Bobby shook Trevor's hand, noting the man's soft palms and manicured nails, the hands of someone who'd never worked a real day in his life. "He was the best man I knew. I'm going to miss him terribly." Diana squeezed Bobby's arm with fake sympathy. "We both will, honey, but at least he's not suffering anymore." The hypocrisy was breathtaking. She was comforting him for grief over a death she had caused, planning to kill him next, all while her lover stood 3 feet away. Bobby wondered if she felt any guilt at all, or if she was simply that cold-blooded. The real performance, however, would come later that afternoon at Arthur Hoffman's law office for the reading of William's will. Bobby had spent weeks preparing for this moment, working with Arthur to craft the perfect trap. Everything had to appear completely legitimate while being absolutely devastating. At 3 p.m., the principal parties gathered in Arthur's conference room. Bobby, Diana, Arthur, and surprisingly, Trevor, who Diana claimed needed to be present for emotional support. Bobby had expected this. Diana would want her partner in crime present to hear the details of what they'd inherit. Arthur cleared his throat and began reading from the thick legal document. "I, William Joseph Kane, being of sound mind and body, do hereby make this my last will and testament." The initial bequests were standard: small gifts to old friends, donations to charities William had supported. Diana fidgeted impatiently, clearly waiting for the main event. Bobby sat perfectly still, his face showing appropriate grief, while internally counting down to detonation. "To my son in all but blood, Robert Kane, who has been the greatest joy of my later years, I leave the entirety of my estate, including all real property, investments, and personal belongings, with the following exceptions." Diana's eyes sharpened. This was the moment she'd been waiting for, the exceptions that would give her legal grounds to contest. Arthur continued, "To Diana Walsh Kane, my son's wife, I leave the sum of $1, as she has already received far more from this family than she deserves." The temperature in the room dropped 10 degrees. Diana's face went white, then red. "That's impossible. As Bobby's spouse, I have community property rights." "Actually," Arthur interrupted smoothly, "you don't. The estate consists entirely of separate property acquired by William before your marriage to Robert. But there's more. He turned the page, and Bobby watched Diana's expression shift from anger to confusion to growing alarm. Furthermore, I am aware that attempts have been made on my life through the deliberate administration of thallium sulfate, placed in my coffee maker and other food sources with the intent to cause my death. I have documented evidence of this attempted murder, including video surveillance and laboratory analysis of the poison residue. Trevor shot to his feet. This is insane. William Kane was a sick old man who... Sit down, Mr. Mills, Arthur said coldly. I'm not finished. Diana's face had gone ash-gray. Bobby, you can't possibly believe. I believe the evidence, Bobby said quietly, his voice carrying the weight of absolute certainty. 23 recorded conversations between you and Trevor discussing my father's murder, your plans for my death, and how you'd split the inheritance. I believe the thallium residue found throughout Dad's apartment. I believe the photographs of you and Trevor together for the past 8 months. He slid a manila folder across the table. Diana opened it with trembling fingers, revealing surveillance photos of her and Trevor in compromising positions, transcripts of their recorded conversations, and laboratory reports documenting the poisoning. This can't be true, Diana whispered, but her voice carried no conviction. Arthur reached for his phone. At this point, I'm required by law to contact the authorities. Attempted murder is a serious crime. Wait, Trevor said desperately. You can't prove we actually poisoned anyone. The old man died of natural causes. Actually, Bobby interrupted. Dad's not dead. The silence that followed was deafening. Diana and Trevor stared at him in shock, their carefully constructed plans crumbling around them. You see, when I discovered you were poisoning him, I had him moved to a secure medical facility. The funeral you attended today was for an empty casket. Dad's very much alive and recovering nicely from the thallium poisoning you subjected him to. Bobby stood up slowly, his movement predatory and controlled. Did you really think I'd let you murder my father? Did you honestly believe I was so stupid, so weak, that I wouldn't see what you were doing? Diana's composure finally cracked. Bobby, please, I can explain. Explain what? How you married me for money you thought I'd inherit. How you've been planning my murder for months. How you convinced yourself that I was beneath you when you're nothing but a parasitic whore who targeted a man stupid enough to love you. The words hit Diana like physical blows. Trevor stepped forward aggressively. You can't talk to her like that. Bobby's laugh was genuinely amused. Are you going to defend her honor, Trevor? The honor of a woman who was willing to murder 2 men for money? Or are you upset because your meal ticket just disappeared? Arthur cleared his throat. If I may continue, there are additional provisions in Williams' will that address this exact situation. He turned to another page, his voice taking on a formal tone. In the event that anyone attempts to harm myself or my son Robert Kane, whether through violence, fraud, or other illegal means, I hereby invoke the dissolution clause of certain business partnerships and charitable commitments. Trevor's face went white. What dissolution clause? Bobby smiled coldly. The one that immediately terminates the Kane Foundation's annual donation to the Harbor Children's Foundation. That's $2 million a year that just disappeared, Trevor. I imagine your board of directors will have some questions about the sudden loss of your largest donor. But there's more, Arthur continued. Williams will also contain specific instructions regarding evidence of criminal activity discovered during the investigation of his estate. This evidence is to be provided to law enforcement, the IRS, and relevant professional licensing boards. Bobby reached into his briefcase and pulled out another folder, much thicker than the first. Trevor, meet your past. 3 previous inheritance fraud schemes, 2 suspicious deaths, 1 forged will, and approximately $4 million in unreported income from various scams. Anthony Carrera sends his regards, by the way. Trevor's legs gave out, and he collapsed back into his chair. The name Anthony Carrera clearly meant something to him. Probably the one victim who'd gotten away, who'd spent years building a case against him. As for you, Diana, Bobby continued, his voice now carrying the full weight of his rage, I've already filed for divorce. You'll get exactly what you deserve. Nothing. The prenup you signed is ironclad, and your attempt to murder my father voids any claim you might have had to community property." Diana finally found her voice, though it came out as a strangled whisper. "You can't do this to me. I'm your wife. I love. You love nothing but money and yourself." Bobby cut her off. 20 years of marriage, and it was all a lie. Every kiss, every smile, every time you told me you loved me. It was all just a performance while you waited for the right moment to cash in. That's when the conference room door opened and Detective Ray Morrison walked in, followed by 2 uniformed officers. Bobby had worked with Ray on several cases over the years, providing security consultation for high-profile investigations. "Sorry to interrupt," Ray said, though his tone suggested he wasn't sorry at all. "We have warrants for the arrest of Diana Walsh Kane and Trevor Mills on charges of attempted murder, conspiracy to commit murder, and fraud." Chapter 4. The Reckoning begins. The arrests were swift and professional. Diana's hysterical protests echoed through Arthur's law office as the handcuffs clicked around her wrists, her designer heels sliding on the polished floor as she struggled against the officers. Trevor, by contrast, went quietly, his face a mask of defeated resignation. He knew exactly what evidence Bobby had compiled against him. "This is a mistake," Diana screamed as they led her toward the door. "Bobby, you know I would never hurt William. I love him like a father." Bobby watched impassively as his wife of 20 years was dragged away in handcuffs. He felt nothing, no satisfaction, no regret, just cold emptiness where love used to live. Arthur closed his briefcase with a satisfied click. "The divorce papers will be filed tomorrow morning. Given the criminal charges, we can fast-track the proceedings. Diana will be fighting for her freedom, not your assets." Detective Morrison lingered after the uniforms had taken Diana and Trevor away. "Hell of a thing, Bobby. 20 years of marriage, and she was planning to kill you both." "Not planning, Ray. Actively trying. If I hadn't caught it when I did, Dad would be dead within the week, and I wouldn't have been far behind. The evidence you provided is solid. Phone records, surveillance footage, the poison residue. It's enough to put them away for decades. But I have to ask, how long did you know?" Bobby considered the question. "I suspected something was wrong for months, but I didn't know the full scope until 3 weeks ago. That's when I brought in Marcus for surveillance." Ray nodded approvingly. Marcus Riley's reputation in law enforcement circles was sterling. His evidence would be unimpeachable in court. "What about the old man? When can we interview him?" "Dad's recovering at a private facility. The doctors say he'll be fully detoxified within another week. He's eager to testify." After Ray left, Bobby found himself alone in the conference room with Arthur. The lawyer poured 2 glasses of bourbon from a crystal decanter he kept for especially trying days. "In 40 years of practice, I've seen a lot of ugly divorces," Arthur said, handing Bobby a glass. "But this is something else entirely. How are you holding up?" Bobby stared into the amber liquid, seeing his reflection distorted in its surface. "I keep thinking about all the signs I missed, all the times I should have seen what she really was." "You saw what she wanted you to see. That's what makes sociopaths so dangerous. They're excellent performers. 20 years, Arthur. 20 years of living with someone who was planning to murder me. How does someone do that? How does someone kiss you goodnight while researching untraceable poisons?" Arthur's expression was grim. "The same way they comfort you at your father's funeral after they poison him. Diana Walsh Kane is a special kind of evil, Bobby. The kind that wears a beautiful face and speaks with a loving voice while planning your destruction." Bobby's phone buzzed. A text from Marcus. "Package delivered. Target acquired." The message meant that Anthony Carrera had arrived in Seattle with additional evidence against Trevor Mills, and that they were ready to proceed with the next phase of Bobby's plan. Destroying Diana and Trevor legally was just the beginning. Bobby wanted them to lose everything. Their freedom, their reputations, their futures, and most importantly, their hope. "I need to make a call," Bobby told Arthur, stepping outside the office. Anthony answered immediately. "It's done. Trevor's been arrested, and I provided the Chicago PD with everything they need to reopen Rebecca's case. They're issuing new warrants. Rebecca Carrera, Anthony's wife, who had died in a suspicious car accident 6 months after becoming involved with Trevor's charity work. The police had ruled it accidental, but Anthony had never stopped believing Trevor was responsible. What about the financial records? That's the beautiful part. Trevor's been running a Ponzi scheme through the foundation for years, using new donations to pay off previous commitments while skimming millions off the top. When the Kane Foundation donation disappears, the whole structure collapses. His board of directors called an emergency meeting for tomorrow morning. Bobby smiled grimly. How long before he's completely destroyed? Financially? By the end of the week. Legally? The Chicago charges will take longer, but between the evidence you've provided and what I've compiled, he's looking at multiple life sentences. And Diana? Her connection to Trevor makes her complicit in everything he's done. Conspiracy charges, accessory to murder, fraud. She's going down with the ship. Bobby hung up and stood in the late afternoon drizzle, feeling the cold rain on his face. 24 hours ago, he'd been a man with a faithless wife and a dying father. Now he was a man with enemies in jail and a father recovering in safety. The transformation should have felt more satisfying. His phone rang. William calling from the secure medical facility. Bobby? I watched the whole thing on the video feed. You did good, son. How are you feeling, Dad? Stronger every day. The doctors say I'll be back to full health within a month. But that's not why I'm calling. William's voice carried a weight Bobby hadn't heard before. I want you to know that what Diana said about me never liking you. That was the biggest lie of all. You saved my life, Bobby. Not just today, but 23 years ago when you let me become your father. Bobby felt his throat tighten. Dad, let me finish. I was a lonely old man heading toward a bitter end when I found you sleeping in that car. You gave me purpose, pride, a reason to build something worth leaving behind. Diana could never understand that because she never understood what real family means. She fooled me for 20 years. No, son, you fooled yourself for 20 years because you wanted to believe in the family you'd created. That's not weakness, that's hope. And hope is what separates men like us from parasites like her. After ending the call, Bobby drove through the Seattle streets, past the neighborhoods where he'd grown up rough, past the harbor where William had found him, past the mansion where Diana had played loving wife while planning his murder. The city looked different now, as if the rain had washed away illusions he hadn't realized were clouding his vision. By the time he reached his office, Marcus was waiting with updates from the ongoing surveillance of Diana and Trevor's known associates. The arrests had triggered a panicked response from their network of accomplices, associates scrambling to distance themselves, destroying evidence, making desperate phone calls to lawyers and fixers. They're scared, Marcus reported. Word is getting out that Trevor's operation has been completely compromised. 3 of his previous victims have already contacted law enforcement, offering to cooperate. Bobby studied the surveillance photos spread across his desk. Faces of people who had enabled Diana and Trevor's crimes, who had profited from their schemes, who had helped them target vulnerable victims. A network of predators that extended far beyond his personal betrayal. Marcus, I want them all. All of them. Every single person who helped them, enabled them, or profited from their crimes. I want their lives destroyed as thoroughly as they destroyed their victims' lives. Marcus nodded slowly. That's a lot of enemies, Bobby. You sure you want to start that kind of war? Bobby thought about Diana's cold laughter as she discussed his murder, about Trevor's casual planning of William's death, about all the other victims who had suffered while these predators operated with impunity. It's not a war, Marcus. Wars have 2 sides fighting each other. This is an extermination. Chapter 5. The network unravels. The Harbor Children's Foundation imploded spectacularly. By Friday morning, news vans surrounded the downtown Seattle office building as FBI agents carried out boxes of evidence. Trevor's arrest had triggered a federal investigation into charity fraud, revealing a web of corruption that reached across multiple states. Bobby watched the coverage from his office, sipping coffee while reading updates from his various sources. The foundation's board of directors had called an emergency meeting to discuss Trevor's arrest, only to discover that their organization was essentially bankrupt. Without the Kane Foundation's annual $2 million donation, they couldn't meet their financial obligations, and donors were already demanding refunds. Patricia entered with a morning briefing. Channel 7 wants a statement about the Kane Foundation's involvement. The Times is running a profile on Diana's arrest, and you've received calls from 3 different publishers interested in book rights. No statements, no interviews, no book deals, Bobby replied without looking up from the surveillance reports. This isn't entertainment. The reports made for fascinating reading. Anthony Carrera's investigation had revealed that Trevor Mills was the central figure in a network of inheritance fraudsters operating across the Pacific Northwest. They targeted wealthy elderly individuals and their adult children, using charities and social organizations as cover for elaborate long-term cons. Diana hadn't been Trevor's first married accomplice. Over the past decade, he'd cultivated relationships with at least 6 other wealthy wives, each of whom had provided inside information about their family's finances, health issues, and succession plans. 3 of those relationships had ended in suspicious deaths that had been ruled accidental or natural. But the most disturbing discovery was the systematic nature of their operation. Trevor's charity work had given him access to detailed financial information about Seattle's wealthiest families. He'd used this information to identify targets, research their vulnerabilities, and plan elaborate schemes to steal their assets. Bobby's phone buzzed, a call for Detective Morrison. "We got a problem, Bobby." Diana's lawyer is claiming she was coerced by Trevor, that she was a victim of psychological manipulation and abuse. What kind of problem? The kind where she might get a reduced sentence by testifying against Trevor and his network. The DA's office is considering a plea deal. Bobby set down his coffee carefully. What kind of plea deal? 15 years instead of life, with possibility of parole in 10, in exchange for full cooperation and testimony against Trevor and his associates. The idea of Diana receiving anything less than a life sentence made Bobby's vision go red. She had planned his murder with cold calculation, had poisoned his father slowly and deliberately, had betrayed 20 years of marriage for money. She deserved to rot in prison until she died. "Ray, I need to speak with the DA personally." "Bobby, I know you're angry, but..." "Not angry. Determined. Diana, Kane doesn't get to play victim after attempting to murder 2 people. I have evidence that proves she was a willing participant, not a coerced victim." That afternoon, Bobby sat across from District Attorney Sarah Chun in her downtown office. Sarah was a tough prosecutor in her 40s who had built her reputation on complex white-collar crime cases. She listened impassively as Bobby presented additional evidence that Patricia's team had compiled. These financial records show Diana's independent research into inheritance law, estate planning, and community property rights. Bobby explained, spreading documents across Sarah's desk. "This isn't the behavior of a manipulated victim. This is the behavior of someone planning a heist." Sarah examined the evidence, printed emails, browser history, library checkout records showing Diana had spent months researching legal strategies for contesting wills and claiming inheritance rights. She also made 3 separate inquiries to private investigators about surveillance countermeasures. Bobby continued. She was actively planning to avoid detection, not passively following Trevor's orders. "This is comprehensive," Sarah admitted. But her attorney is arguing that she was psychologically manipulated over a long period, that Trevor isolated her from friends and family, made her dependent on his approval. Bobby laughed bitterly. Isolated from friends and family? She was having weekly lunches with her book club, monthly dinners with her college sorority sisters, and spent Christmas with her parents in Portland. Trevor didn't isolate her. He recruited her. Sarah leaned back in her chair, studying Bobby's face. "You want her to get the maximum sentence. I want her to get what she deserves. She planned to murder my father and me for money, Sarah. She researched untraceable poisons, discussed methods of making our deaths look accidental, and celebrated our anticipated suffering. That's not manipulation. That's malice." What about Trevor's network? "We could use her testimony to bring down a larger criminal organization." "You don't need her testimony. Anthony Carrera has been building a case against Trevor for 2 years. He has evidence, witnesses, and documentation of previous crimes. I can provide financial records that show the full scope of their fraud network. Diana's cooperation isn't necessary for prosecution. Sarah considered this, flipping through the evidence files. You've been thorough. I've been motivated. 2 hours later, Bobby left the DA's office with Sarah's commitment to reject any plea deal for Diana. She would face trial for attempted murder, conspiracy to commit murder, and fraud, charges that carried a potential life sentence without parole. But Bobby wasn't finished. The network that had enabled Diana and Trevor's crimes extended beyond their immediate circle. The Foundation's board of directors had either been criminally negligent or actively complicit in the fraud. The social workers who had provided them with confidential information about vulnerable elderly clients had violated professional ethics and enabled elder abuse. The private investigators who had helped them research targets had operated outside legal boundaries. Bobby wanted them all held accountable. That evening, he met with Marcus and Anthony at a secure location, a private dining room in a hotel that Bobby's company regularly swept for surveillance devices. The three men sat around a polished conference table, surrounded by files, photographs, and digital evidence that represented months of investigation. "Trevor's talking," Anthony reported. "Not cooperating, just talking. Trying to minimize his involvement, claiming he was manipulated by Diana." Marcus snorted. Both of them are pointing fingers at each other. Classic criminal behavior when the partnership falls apart. Bobby studied surveillance photos of the Foundation's board members, wealthy socialites who had provided legitimacy to Trevor's operation while either ignoring or actively concealing evidence of fraud. "What about the board?" "That's where it gets interesting," Anthony said. 3 of the board members received significant kickbacks disguised as consulting fees. They knew the Foundation was being used to launder money and identify targets. And the others? Willfully ignorant. They wanted the social status of charity board membership without the responsibility of actual oversight. Bobby made a decision that would have far-reaching consequences. "I want them all exposed. Board members, complicit social workers, corrupt investigators. Everyone who enabled this network needs to face consequences." "That's a lot of powerful people," Marcus warned. "Some of them have serious political connections. Then they should have been more careful about who they associated with." Anthony leaned forward. "What exactly are you proposing?" Bobby's smile was sharp and cold. "Total warfare. We destroy their reputations, their careers, their social standing, and their freedom. Every single person who profited from or enabled these crimes faces complete destruction." "That's not justice, Bobby. That's revenge. Sometimes they're the same thing." Chapter 6. The War Begins. The first casualty was Dr. Margaret Foster, a prominent geriatrician who had provided Trevor with confidential information about her elderly patients' medical conditions, family dynamics, and financial situations. Dr. Foster had believed she was helping coordinate charitable services for vulnerable clients. She hadn't realized she was enabling a criminal network to identify and target victims. Bobby's investigative team had uncovered evidence that Dr. Foster had received substantial donations to her private practice from Trevor's Foundation, donations that coincidentally followed her reports on specific patients who later became fraud victims. The Washington State Medical Board received a comprehensive complaint detailing Dr. Foster's breach of patient confidentiality and her role in enabling elder abuse. The investigation moved swiftly. Within a week, Dr. Foster's medical license was suspended pending a full review. Local news outlets picked up the story, portraying her as a doctor who had betrayed her patients' trust for financial benefit. Her practice collapsed as patients fled and malpractice lawsuits were filed by families of Trevor's victims. Bobby felt no satisfaction watching Dr. Foster's professional destruction. This wasn't about pleasure, it was about consequences. People who enabled predators needed to understand that their actions had serious repercussions. The second target was harder to reach. Judge Harold Brennan had expedited probate proceedings for several of Trevor's previous schemes, allowing fraudulent wills and estate transfers to be processed without proper scrutiny. Judge Brennan's connection to Trevor appeared to be purely financial. The Foundation had made substantial donations to his wife's art gallery over several years. Exposing a sitting judge required delicate maneuvering. Bobby couldn't directly attack Brennan without risking legal retaliation, but he could provide evidence to the appropriate authorities and let the system handle the consequences. The Washington State Commission on Judicial Conduct received a detailed complaint outlining Brennan's suspicious pattern of rulings in cases involving Trevor's network. The investigation into Judge Brennan triggered a broader review of his court decisions over the past 5 years. Reporters began digging into his financial connections, his wife's gallery funding, and his relationship with local charities. The resulting scandal forced Brennan to recuse himself from all pending cases while the Judicial Commission conducted its investigation. But the most satisfying target was Councilwoman Lisa Park, who had used her position on the Seattle City Council to provide Trevor with inside information about municipal senior services, housing programs, and social welfare resources. Councilwoman Park had essentially given Trevor a roadmap to Seattle's most vulnerable elderly residents. Bobby's team had recorded conversations between Park and Trevor discussing specific elderly individuals who were struggling with housing costs, medical bills, or family conflicts. Precisely the vulnerabilities that Trevor exploited in his schemes. Park had received campaign contributions from Trevor's network in exchange for this information. The evidence against Councilwoman Park was released strategically. First, leaked audio recordings appeared on investigative journalism websites. Then, financial records showing suspicious campaign contributions were provided to the Seattle Ethics Commission. Finally, testimony from Trevor's victims confirmed that their personal information had been shared without consent. The political scandal that followed was spectacular. Councilwoman Park attempted to claim she had been trying to help vulnerable constituents, but the recorded conversations revealed her callous disregard for their welfare. She resigned from the city council within 2 weeks, facing potential criminal charges for corruption and elder abuse. But Bobby's war wasn't limited to official channels. His security company had connections throughout Seattle's business and social community, and he used those connections to systematically destroy the reputations of Trevor's enablers. Richard Carver, the private investigator who had helped Trevor research potential victims, found his investigative license revoked and his client base evaporating as word spread about his role in elder fraud. Beverly Hutchins, the social worker who had provided Trevor with confidential client information, was fired from her position and blacklisted from social services work throughout Washington state. Each destruction was methodical, thorough, and irreversible. Bobby didn't just want these people to face consequences. He wanted them to understand that their lives had been permanently altered by their choices to enable criminals. The psychological impact was devastating. Several of Trevor's former associates attempted to contact Bobby directly, seeking to negotiate some kind of accommodation or understanding. They offered information, cooperation, even financial restitution in exchange for ending the systematic destruction of their lives. Bobby rejected every overture. This wasn't a negotiation, it was a reckoning. The media began to notice the pattern. A Seattle Times investigation titled "The Network's Collapse" documented how the arrest of 2 individuals had triggered the destruction of an entire criminal infrastructure. The article portrayed Bobby as either a dedicated justice seeker or a ruthless vigilante, depending on the reader's perspective. Bobby didn't care about media coverage. He cared about results. By the end of the month, Trevor's network had been completely dismantled. Every person who had enabled, supported, or profited from their crimes was facing serious consequences. Criminal charges, professional destruction, financial ruin, or social ostracism. But the war's most important battle was still being fought in court, where Diana and Trevor faced trial for attempted murder. The prosecution's case was overwhelming. Audio recordings of Diana and Trevor discussing Bobby's murder were played for the jury, their voices cold and calculating as they planned his death. Laboratory evidence confirmed the thallium poisoning of William Kane, while surveillance footage showed Diana and Trevor's affair and conspiracy. Diana's defense attorney tried desperately to portray her as a victim of Trevor's manipulation, but Bobby's evidence made that impossible. Her independent research into inheritance law, her inquiries about surveillance countermeasures, and her active participation in planning murders demonstrated clear criminal intent. Trevor's defense strategy was equally futile. His attorney attempted to claim that the conversations were fantasy role-playing, that no actual crimes had been committed, and that William Kane's death was natural. But William's surprise appearance as a prosecution witness, very much alive and recovering from thallium poisoning, destroyed that narrative completely. The trial lasted 3 weeks. Bobby testified for 6 hours, methodically presenting evidence while maintaining perfect composure. He described discovering his wife's betrayal, investigating her crimes, and protecting his father from murder, all in a calm, factual tone that made the jury's task simple. Diana's testimony was a disaster. She broke down repeatedly, alternating between claims of innocence and accusations against Trevor. Her performance convinced no one, especially when audio recordings of her voice were played immediately after her denials. Trevor never took the stand. His attorney recognized that any testimony would only provide additional opportunities for the prosecution to present damaging evidence. The jury deliberated for less than 4 hours. Guilty on all counts. Chapter 7. Justice Served. The sentencing hearing took place on a cold December morning, 8 months after William Kane's fake funeral had triggered the elaborate trap that destroyed Diana and Trevor's network. Bobby sat in the courtroom's front row, wearing the same black suit he'd worn to his father's memorial service, watching as the woman who had planned his murder learned her fate. Diana looked haggard after months in jail awaiting trial. Her designer wardrobe had been replaced by an orange jumpsuit, her perfect makeup and styling abandoned for the harsh reality of incarceration. She'd aged years and months, and Bobby felt no sympathy for her transformation. Judge Patricia Wong reviewed the sentencing guidelines with methodical precision. Diana Walsh Kane faced charges of attempted murder in the first degree, conspiracy to commit murder, elder abuse, and fraud. The prosecution had recommended life imprisonment without possibility of parole. Mrs. Kane, Judge Wong said, her voice carrying the weight of absolute authority, you have been convicted of attempting to murder your husband's adoptive father through systematic poisoning, planning the subsequent murder of your husband, and defrauding victims through an elaborate criminal conspiracy. Diana's attorney made a final plea for mercy, arguing that his client had been manipulated by Trevor Mills and deserved consideration for her previously clean record. The argument fell flat. The jury had heard Diana's recorded voice planning murders with cold calculation. The court finds that Mrs. Kane was not a victim of manipulation, but an active and willing participant in a criminal enterprise that showed callous disregard for human life. Judge Wong continued. The premeditated nature of these crimes, combined with the defendant's clear intent to commit additional murders, warrants the maximum sentence allowed by law. Diana Walsh Kane, you are hereby sentenced to life imprisonment without possibility of parole. Diana's legs gave out, and she collapsed in her chair, sobbing hysterically. Her parents, sitting in the gallery, wept openly as they watched their daughter receive what amounted to a death sentence. Bobby felt nothing. No satisfaction, no regret, just the cold certainty that justice had been served. Trevor's sentencing followed immediately. His case was more complex due to evidence of previous crimes in multiple states, but the result was identical. Life imprisonment without parole, with additional consecutive sentences for his role in other suspicious deaths. After the hearing, Bobby stood on the courthouse steps with William, who had made a full recovery from the thallium poisoning. At 75, the old man looked healthier than he had in years, his eyes bright with the satisfaction of seeing his would-be murderers face justice. "How do you feel?" William asked as they watched Diana's parents emerge from the courthouse, broken by their daughter's crimes and punishment. "Empty," Bobby admitted. "I thought I'd feel something more. Justice often feels that way. It's not about satisfaction, it's about balance." Diana and Trevor disrupted the natural order by trying to murder innocent people for money. Now the balance has been restored. Bobby nodded, understanding what his father meant. This had never been about revenge, despite what some observers claimed. It had been about consequences, ensuring that people who chose to harm others faced appropriate punishment for their choices. Detective Morrison approached them with final updates on the broader investigation. "We've wrapped up the last of the network cases. Dr. Foster pled guilty to elder abuse and breach of confidentiality. She'll serve 2 years and lose her medical license permanently. Judge Brennan resigned and won't face criminal charges, but his judicial career is over. Councilwoman Park is looking at corruption charges and possible jail time. What about the other victims? Bobby asked. 3 families are filing civil suits against Trevor's estate and the foundation. Anthony Carrera's evidence helped us reopen 4 suspicious death cases from the past decade. Trevor won't be tried for those. He's already serving life, but the families finally have answers. The network that had enabled Diana and Trevor's crimes had been completely dismantled. Every person who had profited from or facilitated their schemes faced serious consequences, from criminal charges to professional destruction to financial ruin. The elaborate infrastructure that had allowed them to operate for years had been permanently shattered. But Bobby's war had one final target: himself. Over the following weeks, he underwent a systematic review of his own life, searching for weaknesses and blind spots that had allowed Diana to deceive him for 20 years. He hired an independent security firm to audit his company's operations, ensuring that no other employees had access to information that could be used against him or his clients. He also began the process of completely restructuring his personal life. The Bellevue mansion where he'd lived with Diana was sold, the proceeds donated to legitimate elder abuse prevention organizations. He moved into a secure penthouse apartment downtown, closer to his office, and protected by military-grade security systems. Most importantly, he ended his emotional isolation. 4 months after Diana's arrest, Bobby had withdrawn from social contact, trusting no one and viewing every interaction as potentially deceptive. But William's guidance helped him understand that complete isolation was another form of defeat. Diana didn't just try to kill your body, William explained during one of their weekly dinners. She tried to kill your ability to trust, to love, to believe in other people. If you let her succeed in that, she wins even from prison. Bobby began reconnecting with old friends and business associates, carefully, but genuinely rebuilding social connections that Diana's betrayal had damaged. He also started dating again. Nothing serious, but enough to remind himself that not all relationships were built on deception and malice. The process was slow and sometimes painful. Bobby found himself analyzing every interaction, looking for signs of manipulation or hidden motives. But gradually, he learned to distinguish between reasonable caution and paranoid isolation. 6 months after Diana's sentencing, Bobby received an unexpected visitor at his office. Anthony Carrera had returned to Seattle, not for business, but to express his gratitude for Bobby's role in finally bringing Trevor Mills to justice. "I spent 2 years trying to prove that Trevor killed my wife," Anthony said as they sat in Bobby's secure conference room. "The police thought I was a grief-stricken husband chasing conspiracy theories. You made it possible to expose the truth. We both wanted the same thing," Bobby replied. "Justice for our families. More than that, you showed me that sometimes the system needs help to work properly." Trevor's network operated for years because good people looked the other way or didn't dig deep enough to find the truth. Anthony's words crystallized something Bobby had been thinking about for months. His war against Diana and Trevor's network had revealed systematic weaknesses in how society protected vulnerable people from sophisticated predators. Elder abuse was often overlooked, inheritance fraud was difficult to prove, and criminal networks operated with impunity because their crimes crossed jurisdictional boundaries. What if we could fix some of those problems? Bobby asked. "What do you mean?" "A foundation dedicated to investigating and exposing elder abuse, inheritance fraud, and similar crimes. Staffed by former law enforcement, private investigators, and forensic accountants. Focused on cases that fall through the cracks of traditional law enforcement." Anthony's eyes lit up with interest. "Using your security company's resources?" "Using everything: resources, connections, expertise. Making it impossible for people like Trevor and Diana to operate without being caught." The Kane Foundation for Elder Protection was established 3 months later, funded by the proceeds from Bobby's divorce settlement and Diana's forfeited assets. The foundation's mission was simple: identify, investigate, and expose crimes against elderly and vulnerable adults, providing evidence to law enforcement and support to victims' families. Bobby served as the foundation's director, using his business expertise and security connections to build an effective organization. Anthony became the chief investigator, bringing his passion for justice and his extensive knowledge of inheritance fraud schemes. They recruited a team of former FBI agents, retired prosecutors, forensic accountants, and victim advocates. The Foundation's first major case involved a suspicious pattern of deaths at a Portland nursing home, where elderly residents with substantial assets were dying unexpectedly while leaving their estates to a healthcare aide who had worked at the facility for less than 6 months. The local police had dismissed family concerns, attributing the deaths to natural causes and coincidence. The Foundation's investigation revealed a sophisticated scheme involving forged wills, manipulated medications, and systematic isolation of victims from their families. Within 6 months, the healthcare aide and 3 accomplices were arrested, charged with multiple counts of murder and fraud. The case made national news, establishing the Kane Foundation as a serious force in elder protection advocacy. Requests for assistance began arriving from across the country. Families desperate for help investigating suspicious deaths, financial exploitation, and caregiver abuse. Bobby found purpose in this work that his business success had never provided. Each case represented someone's family member who deserved protection, someone's parent or grandparent who had been targeted by predators. The Foundation's success meant that fewer families would experience the betrayal and loss that he and Anthony had endured. Chapter 8. The Letter. 2 years after Diana's sentencing, Bobby received a letter from her. It arrived at his office on a Tuesday morning, forwarded through multiple law enforcement channels before reaching his desk. The envelope was thin and unmarked except for his name, written in Diana's familiar handwriting. Bobby stared at the letter for several minutes before opening it, wondering what his former wife could possibly have to say after 2 years of imprisonment. Her trial testimony had been a mixture of lies, self-pity, and desperate attempts to minimize her crimes. He expected more of the same. Dear Bobby, I know you probably don't want to hear from me, and I understand why. What I did was unforgivable, and I don't expect forgiveness. But I needed to write this letter, not for you, but for myself. Prison gives you a lot of time to think, and I've spent 2 years trying to understand how I became the person who could plan to murder someone I claim to love. The easy answer is to blame Trevor, to say he manipulated me into becoming something I wasn't. But that's not true. The truth is that I was always selfish, always looking for the easy path, always believing that I deserved more than I had earned. When I married you, I thought I was settling for less than I deserved. You came from nothing, and even though you built something impressive, I never stopped seeing you as beneath me. That's the real crime, Bobby, not the attempted murder, not the betrayal, but the 20 years I spent lying to both of us about who I really was. You deserved a wife who saw your worth, who appreciated your strength, who loved you for who you were instead of what you could provide. Trevor didn't make me a killer. He just gave me permission to become what I'd always been underneath, someone who would do anything for money and status, someone who saw other people as obstacles to getting what I wanted. I know about the foundation you started, about the work you're doing to protect people like William from people like me. The other inmates think it's ironic that my crimes led to something that helps prevent similar crimes. I think it's fitting. At least some good came from the evil I chose to embrace. I won't ask for your forgiveness because I don't deserve it. I won't ask you to visit because you shouldn't have to see me. I just wanted you to know that I understand what I destroyed, and it wasn't just your trust or your marriage. It was 20 years of your life that you can never get back. I hope you find someone who sees what I was too selfish and stupid to see, that you're a good man who deserves to be loved honestly. Diana. Bobby read the letter twice, then placed it in his desk drawer next to the divorce papers he'd signed 3 years earlier. Diana's words rang with an honesty he'd never heard from her during their marriage or trial, but they came too late to matter. He felt no forgiveness, no renewed anger, no sadness for what might have been. Diana had made choices that revealed her true character, and now she was living with the consequences of those choices. Her belated self-awareness didn't change the fundamental facts of what she'd done. But the letter did clarify something important for Bobby. His war against Diana and Trevor's network hadn't been about revenge. It had been about ensuring that consequences matched choices. Diana had chosen to plan murders for money, and now she was spending the rest of her life in prison. Trevor had chosen to build a career on exploiting vulnerable people, and now he was facing the same fate. The Foundation's work was an extension of the same principle. People who chose to harm others needed to face appropriate consequences, even when the system failed to provide them automatically. That afternoon, Bobby met with Patricia to review applications for the Foundation's next major case. They'd received a request from a family in Denver whose elderly patriarch had died suspiciously after changing his will to benefit a caregiver he'd known for only 3 months. The local authorities had declined to investigate, accepting the caregiver's claim that the old man had fallen downstairs while alone in his house. The medical examiner found injuries consistent with a fall, Patricia reported, but the family hired an independent pathologist who identified defensive wounds on the victim's hands and arms. What about the will change? Executed 2 weeks before his death, witnessed by the caregiver's boyfriend and sister. The old man left his entire $3 million estate to someone he'd known for less than 90 days, cutting out children and grandchildren he'd been close to for decades. Bobby studied the case file, seeing familiar patterns in the caregiver's behavior. Isolation of the victim from family, gradual assumption of control over finances, and suspicious timing of legal changes. This was exactly the kind of case the Foundation had been created to handle. St. Anthony to Denver, Bobby decided. Full investigation, all resources. This family deserves answers. As Patricia left to make arrangements, Bobby returned to his office window, looking out at the Seattle skyline. 3 years ago, he'd stood in this same spot, suspecting that his wife was betraying him, but having no idea of the scope of her crimes. Now Diana was serving life in prison. Trevor's network was destroyed, and the Foundation was protecting families across the country from similar predators. The transformation felt surreal sometimes. Bobby had gone from a successful businessman with a secret enemy living in his house to a widower dedicated to preventing others from experiencing similar betrayals. The change had cost him his marriage, his trust in relationships, and years of emotional recovery, but it had also given him a sense of purpose he'd never experienced in pure business success. His phone buzzed. A text from William, now 77 and still recovering from the psychological impact of being slowly poisoned by someone he'd trusted. "Dinner tonight? I have news." Bobby smiled, the first genuine expression of happiness he'd felt all day. Whatever challenges lay ahead, whatever new cases the Foundation would handle, whatever personal healing still needed to happen, he had his father. Diana's betrayal had revealed the strength of that bond rather than weakening it. On my way, he texted back. The Kane family would survive and thrive, built on genuine love and loyalty instead of the manufactured affection that had nearly destroyed them both. Chapter 9. The Final Reckoning. 5 years after Diana's sentencing, Bobby stood in the lobby of the Washington State Penitentiary for Women, holding a visitor's badge and questioning his decision to be there. Diana had requested a meeting through her attorney, claiming she had information relevant to one of the Foundation's current cases. Bobby had initially refused, but curiosity had eventually overcome his reluctance. The visiting room was sterile and depressing, filled with bolted-down tables and the quiet conversations of inmates and their families. Bobby chose a table near the back, positioned to observe the entire room while maintaining privacy for whatever Diana wanted to discuss. She appeared different than he'd expected. 5 years of prison had hardened her physically. She was thinner, more muscular, with gray threading through her blonde hair and lines around her eyes that spoke of stress and regret. But her posture was straighter, her gaze more direct, as if prison had burned away pretenses that had defined her for decades. "Thank you for coming," Diana said as she sat across from him. "I wasn't sure you would. I almost didn't. What information do you have about the Rodriguez case?" Diana had claimed knowledge about a case the Foundation was investigating in California. an elderly widower who had died after transferring his assets to a woman he'd met through an online dating service. Initial investigation suggested the woman was part of a network that specialized in romance scams targeting lonely seniors. Maria Santos, the woman who scammed Mr. Rodriguez. She was Trevor's protege, Diana said without preamble. He trained her for 2 years before he was arrested, taught her his methods for identifying and manipulating targets. Bobby leaned forward, his interest sharpening. How do you know this? Because I helped recruit her. Trevor wanted attractive women who could play different roles depending on the target. Maria specialized in the grieving widow routine. She'd identify recently bereaved men through obituaries, then contact them through dating sites or social media, claiming to understand their loss. This was new information that could break the Rodriguez case wide open. If Maria Santos was connected to Trevor's network, she might be involved in multiple similar crimes across several states. What else do you know about her operation? She works with a team, a forger who creates fake identities, a tech specialist who manages the online profiles, and a logistics coordinator who handles the financial transfers. They've been operating in California, Nevada, and Arizona for at least 3 years. Diana reached in her pocket and pulled out a folded piece of paper. Names, locations, methods. Everything I remember about how Trevor's network operated and who he trained before his arrest. Bobby examined the paper, recognizing some names from previous Foundation investigations. Diana's information could connect multiple unsolved cases across the western United States, potentially exposing a criminal network that had continued operating even after Trevor's imprisonment. Why are you giving me this? Bobby asked. Diana was quiet for a long moment, her hands folded on the table between them. Because I've had 5 years to think about what I became, and I don't want other families to go through what we put you and William through. That's not an answer. Yes, it is. I chose to become a predator, Bobby. I chose to target someone who loved me, to plan his murder for money, to help someone else murder an innocent old man. Those weren't mistakes or momentary lapses. They were choices that revealed who I really was. Diana's voice carried a weight Bobby had never heard during their marriage. Genuine remorse mixed with clear-eyed understanding of her crimes. I can't undo what I did, she continued. I can't give you back 20 years of marriage built on lies, or give William back the months of slow poisoning, or restore the trust one destroyed. But I can help prevent other people from experiencing what we put you through. Bobby studied his former wife's face, looking for signs of manipulation or hidden agenda. But Diana's expression was open and direct, without the calculated charm that had defined her for decades. The Foundation has helped 16 families get justice for murdered relatives, Diana said. I've been following your work through news reports and letters from other inmates whose crimes you've exposed. You've become what I should have been, someone who protects vulnerable people instead of exploiting them. Bobby folded the paper and put it in his jacket pocket. This information will help us save lives. I hope so. I need to believe that some good can come from the evil I chose to embrace. They sat in silence for several minutes, both processing the strange circumstances that had brought them together. Bobby found himself studying Diana's hands, the same hands that had once caressed his face while she planned his murder, now calloused from prison work and marked by small scars from institutional life. Do you ever think about what might have been different? Diana asked quietly. You mean if you hadn't been planning to kill me? I mean if I had been different. If I had seen what you were really worth instead of focusing on what I thought I deserved. Bobby considered the question seriously. I think about it sometimes. But the person who could have loved me honestly wouldn't have been you, Diana. That person would have been someone else entirely. Diana nodded, accepting the brutal honesty without defensiveness. You're right. The woman who could have been worthy of your love would never have made the choices I made. Why didn't you fight the divorce? Bobby asked, voicing a question that had puzzled him for years. You could have contested the prenup, claimed community property rights, dragged the proceedings out for years. Because I knew I didn't deserve anything from you. The money, the house, the lifestyle, none of it was mine. I hadn't earned it through love or partnership. I'd been stealing it through deception. The visiting period was ending, and guards were beginning to signal for inmates to prepare to return to their cells. Diana stood slowly, her movements showing the cautious discipline of someone who'd learned to navigate a dangerous environment. "Bobby," she said, "I know you'll never forgive me, and I'm not asking you to. But I need you to know that destroying our marriage wasn't the worst thing I did. The worst thing was wasting 20 years of your life with someone who couldn't see your worth." Bobby stood as well, looking at his former wife, the woman who had shared his bed while planning his murder, who had comforted him at his father's fake funeral after trying to poison William, who had betrayed every promise and vow of their marriage for money. "Goodbye, Diana. Goodbye, Bobby. I hope you find what I was too broken to give you." Bobby walked out of the prison into the late afternoon sunshine, feeling a sense of closure he hadn't expected. Diana's information would help the Foundation solve multiple cases and protect other families from similar crimes. Her acknowledgement of what she destroyed provided a kind of ending to a story that had haunted him for 5 years. But more importantly, the meeting had confirmed something Bobby had suspected but hadn't been sure of. He was free. Diana's betrayal no longer defined him. Her crimes no longer consumed his thoughts, and her memory no longer poisoned his ability to trust and love. That evening, Bobby had dinner with William at their favorite restaurant, the same place they'd eaten the night William told him about updating his will 5 years and a lifetime ago. William was now 80, still sharp and engaged, but moving more slowly and depending more on Bobby for emotional support. "How did it go?" William asked after Bobby described the prison visit. "Better than I expected. She gave us information that will help solve several cases, and she acknowledged what she'd done without making excuses. Do you feel any differently about her?" Bobby considered the question while watching Seattle's lights reflect on the water outside the restaurant windows. "I feel sorry for her, I suppose. She destroyed her own life as thoroughly as she tried to destroy ours. But I don't feel anger anymore, or betrayal, or loss. She's just someone I used to know who made choices that revealed her true character." William nodded approvingly. "That's how you know you've healed. When someone who once had the power to destroy you becomes just another person whose actions have consequences." They talked about the Foundation's upcoming cases, William's health, and Bobby's tentative plans to begin dating seriously again. At 82, Bobby was ready to consider the possibility of genuine partnership with someone who could see his worth and share his values. 6 months later, Bobby stood at the altar of a small church in downtown Seattle, watching Catherine Martinez walk down the aisle toward him. Catherine was a prosecuting attorney he'd met through the Foundation's work, a brilliant, compassionate woman who understood the importance of justice and the cost of betrayal. William served as Bobby's best man, beaming with pride as his son married a woman who loved him honestly. The ceremony was small and intimate, attended by close friends and Foundation colleagues who had become Bobby's chosen family. As Bobby and Catherine exchanged vows, he thought briefly about Diana, serving life in prison for crimes that had revealed the emptiness where love should have lived. Then he focused on Catherine's eyes, seeing genuine affection and respect that Diana had never felt, feeling the security of a partnership built on truth instead of deception. The Kane family had survived betrayal, attempted murder, and systematic destruction, emerging stronger and more purposeful than before. The Foundation continued to protect vulnerable families across the country. Diana and Trevor served life sentences for their crimes, and Bobby had found love with someone worthy of trust. Justice had been served, consequences had matched choices, and the balance had been restored. In the end, that was enough. And there you have it. Another story comes to an end. What did you think? I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments below. If you enjoy this story, consider joining our community by subscribing. It means the world to us. For more stories like this one, check out the recommended videos on screen. And I'll see you there.